There is a question that haunts the soul drinkers above all others, and it is the kind of question that does not have a comfortable answer. Can you be truly loyal to something you despise? Can a warrior be both faithful and a rebel, both righteous and damned, both servant and destroyer of the very thing they love? In all the vast, blood-soaked history of the 41st millennium, very few stories force those questions into the light, quite like this one. The soul drinkers did not fall to chaos in the way that traitor legions fell. They did not kneel to the ruinous powers. They did not raise bloody altars to the gods of the warp or carve devotional icons into their own flesh. They did something stranger, something harder to categorize, and in many ways far more unsettling to the Imperium they had served for thousands of years. They looked at the institution they had pledged their lives to, and they decided it had become something worth fighting against, not the Emperor, not the idea of humanity's survival, but the corrupt, bloated, and rotting machinery of the Imperium itself. And then, everything else happened. The mutations, the civil wars, the daemon princes, the betrayals within betrayals. The millennia-long conspiracy buried inside their own sacred texts, written by a man they thought had died long ago. A plan so deep and patient that it stretched across 6,000 years before it finally detonated like a bomb planted in the foundation of a cathedral. This is the story of the Soul Drinkers, a chapter that turned against the Adeptus Mechanicus, then against their own chapter master, then against the Imperium, then against chaos, then against part of themselves, then against the enemies hunting them, and finally, against the architect of everything that had brought them to ruin, dragging him screaming into the warp as their very last act. They betrayed nearly everyone. And what they never betrayed was the Emperor himself, or the people of the galaxy who needed protecting. Whether that counts as redemption is something you can decide for yourself by the time this story ends. But I will tell you this before we begin. When you finish this, you will understand why some scholars within the Imperium argue, in hushed tones and careful language, that the Soul Drinkers represent one of the most morally interesting chapters in the long history of the Astartes. Not the most powerful, not the most decorated, not the most successful by any conventional measure, but the most honest about what loyalty actually costs when the institution demanding it has itself become something unworthy of the demand. Let us begin at the beginning. Section 1. Born from the Ashes. Origins, Heritage, and the Gift of Rogal Dorn. Before we can understand how completely and catastrophically the Soul Drinkers unraveled, we need to understand what they were, what they started as. Because this is a story that only makes sense if you know the height from which something falls, and understand the specific shape of what was built before the cracks began to form. The Soul Drinkers were created during what is known as the Second Founding, which took place in the years following the Horus Heresy, somewhere in the early 31st millennium. The Horus Heresy was the great catastrophe of human history. Half the Space Marine legions turned against the Emperor under the leadership of Horus Warmaster, the Emperor's most trusted son, and the resulting civil war burned across the galaxy for years. Hundreds of worlds fell. The Astartes, who had been created specifically to be humanity's greatest weapon, became its greatest threat. The Emperor himself was mortally wounded on the bridge of Horus's flagship, and survived only by being interred on the Golden Throne, a machine that keeps his body alive, but traps his consciousness in a state somewhere between death and perpetual psychic labor. The heresy ended, but nothing was ever the same. What came next was a period of rebuilding, of trying to ensure that such a catastrophe could never happen again. One of the first things Rabut Guillemon did in the aftermath was order the surviving legions broken apart. No single commander should ever again have the ability to command a force of 100,000 Astartes. The Codex Astartes, that enormous and enormously detailed document that Guillemon produced, laid out the new order. Space Marine chapters of around 1,000 warriors each, independent and self-contained, answerable to the wider Imperium, but never again capable of being merged into the kind of monolithic forces that the heresy had weaponized against their own people. Rogal Dorn hated this. Of all the surviving Primarchs, Dorn fought longest and hardest against the decision to divide his Imperial Fist's legion. He was a man who measured everything in terms of fortress building and fortification, not just physically, but conceptually, and the idea of taking the brotherhood he had built across centuries of war together and scattering it to the winds felt like a structural failure of the deepest kind. His sons had bled beside him on the walls of the imperial palace. They had held the line when everything else was failing, and now they were to be split into fragments and sent off to forget that they had once been part of something larger and more complete. But in the end, even Rogal Dorn had to bow to the logic of necessity. The heresy had proven that concentrated power in a single charismatic commander was the mechanism of galaxy-level catastrophe. The fragmentation hurt. It was worth it. What came out of the Imperial Fists were multiple successor chapters, each carrying some fragment of their father's heritage forward. The Black Templars, perhaps the most famous, a crusading chapter that carries Dorn's spirit into perpetual holy war across the stars. The Crimson Fists, another proud chapter whose history would have its own catastrophes. And the Soul Drinkers, formed from the fleet-based shock attack elements of the 7th Legion. These were the warriors who had specialized in rapid deployment, boarding actions, ship-to-ship combat, and the kind of violent, precise assault that did not rely on siege lines and careful advance. They smashed through enemy lines before the enemy could react, hit hard and immediately, then were gone before a coherent counter could be organized. Theirs was not the patient, methodical warfare of a fortification specialist, but something faster and more aggressive, a way of fighting that kept the enemy off balance and overwhelmed by pace rather than firepower. Their eventual battle motto said everything about their philosophy: cold and fast. Cold meant controlled, disciplined, never wasting movement or energy on anything except the objective. Fast meant relentless, giving the enemy no time to breathe, to reorient, to find any opening in which to recover. The two words together described a style of war that left very little room for error and relied on the assumption that speed itself was a form of armor. To mark the founding of this new chapter, Rogal Dorn gave them a gift, the Soul Spear. This weapon deserves careful attention because it sits at the very center of everything the Soul Drinkers were and everything that eventually happened to them. The Soul Spear was ancient even by the standards of the 31st millennium, which itself reckoned its history in tens of thousands of years. It was a vortex weapon, a category of armament so powerful and so poorly understood that they might as well be magic by practical standards. Vortex weapons create small, localized portals into the space between real space and the warp, brief windows into a dimensionless non-place from which there is no recovery. Anything caught in the field of a vortex weapon is not destroyed in any conventional sense. It is pulled into something for which the word gone is the only honest description, not reduced to ash, not exploded into fragments, just no longer present in reality in any form that can be retrieved or confirmed. The Soul Spear was particularly refined in this capacity. Where most vortex weapons were unwieldy and difficult to control, the Soul Spear was a precision instrument capable of the kind of targeted application that made it genuinely usable in a close-quarters battlefield rather than simply being a device for area denial. The official history stated that Rogal Dorn himself had found it on a nameless, dark world during the Great Crusade. He had carried it into battle across 100 worlds, using it against the great and terrible things that lurked in the darker corners of the expanding human domain: warp creatures, alien horrors. The particular kind of enemy that conventional weaponry could wound, but never truly finish. It was not merely a weapon. It was a symbol of the Primarch's personal history, his specific journey, the individual road he had walked through, a galaxy, being brought to order by the Emperor's will. And when he gave it to the Soul Drinkers, he was saying something important with the gesture. His spirit would be with them. His glory was theirs now, to continue. What nobody knew was that the Soul Spear was not merely keyed to the genetic signature of Rogal Dorn's bloodline in the way that some ancient weapons are coded to specific users. It was keyed to the Soul Drinkers themselves. Only their specific and unusual genetic profile could activate its power. This was not information available to anyone examining the spear from the outside, and it would not become apparent until thousands of years later when the implications surfaced and suggested something deeply strange about the chapter's true origins, something nobody was comfortable thinking about. But that was all in the distant future. For the moment, the Soul Drinkers took their relic, took their heritage of fleet-based warfare, and went to war. For thousands of years, they served the Imperium faithfully, participating in campaigns across the galaxy. In the 36th millennium, during the Age of Apostasy, when a man named Goj Vandir had concentrated enormous political power in his own hands and declared himself humanity's savior. The Soul Drinkers joined the siege of his palace on Terra itself, the siege that ended his rule. They had been part of history's genuine turning points. They were not a chapter with a troubled reputation. They were orthodox, professional, fleet-based warriors with a record of distinguished service spanning millennia. But there was always something slightly distinctive about them that, in hindsight, hints at what was coming. The Soul Drinkers possessed an overactive omophagia organ. Every Space Marine has an omophagia, one of the 19 standard implants that transform a normal human recruit into an Astartes. When a Space Marine consumes the flesh of a creature, the omophagia allows them to absorb some of that creature's memories. Not complete records, not the creature's whole life, but impressions, fragments, emotional echoes of significant events, recorded biologically in the consumed tissue. The practical intent is intelligence gathering. In the Soul Drinkers, this organ had mutated into something qualitatively different. Their contact with the consumed was more intense, more emotionally complete. They did not merely receive data fragments. They experienced something approaching genuine communion. The chapter had formalized this mutation into a ritual called the Rites of the Libation, a small ceremony where the ranking officer would consume biological material from a golden chalice, while speaking the only words permitted. Know your enemy. The ceremony was treated as spiritual as much as practical, a way of achieving genuine understanding of what was being fought, a way of making the enemy real rather than abstract, making the act of killing into something more conscious than simply eliminating a target. This is almost certainly where the name comes from. Soul Drinkers. They drink the soul, the inner essence, the particular living truth of what they consume. Within the chapter, it was viewed as a mark of purity. By truly knowing the enemy, by drinking its soul, they could never be fooled by it. What nobody recognized was that this mutation was already a sign that the Soul Drinker's gene seed was not entirely what the official records claimed. Imperial Fists do not possess this particular quirk. It belongs to no known lineage in the Imperium's extensive gene seed archives. It was a biological flag waving in a wind that nobody was paying attention to. Their combat philosophy was built on a document called the Catechisms Martial, written by a warrior who had lived in the 36th millennium and been given the title Philosopher Soldier. His name was Dianyathos. Every member of the chapter carried a copy. Its pages describe not just how to fight, but why fighting had meaning, what gave a warrior's service, its moral content, what obligations the chapter owed to those it protected, what distinguished a just war from mere violence in service of bureaucratic objectives. The Catechisms Martial was, by any reasonable assessment, a sophisticated and genuinely thoughtful document. Dianyathos was not a simple man. He understood the difference between the institutions of the Imperium and the purposes those institutions were supposed to serve, and he wrote extensively about the gap between them. He wrote about how warriors should conduct themselves when the institution that commands them has strayed from its founding principles. He wrote about the difference between obedience that strengthens humanity and obedience that diminishes it. But buried within those pages, spread through the philosophical arguments with the patience of someone who had planned everything in advance and was in no hurry at all, was a quiet poison. A slow erosion of trust in the Imperium's institutional authority, a persistent implication that true loyalty was not compliance with the High Lords of Terra, but fidelity to the Emperor's actual purposes, which the bureaucratic apparatus had long since stopped being capable of serving. The chapter was being taught, generation by generation, to place spirit above letter, to think for themselves about whether orders served genuine human good, to take pride in their own moral judgment rather than delegating that judgment to the hierarchy above them. Nobody read those implications clearly for thousands of years. They soaked in slowly, like water finding its way through stone. By the time the Soul Drinkers faced their first real test, the ideological groundwork had already been laid for how they would respond. They had been shaped, without knowing it, to make a specific kind of choice when the moment came. Dianyathos had been patient. He had planted seeds he would not live to see flower, but he had also made arrangements to be present for the harvest. If you have made it this far, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I find it genuinely fascinating how far these stories reach, how many different places and different moments in the day people find themselves thinking about the moral corners of a fictional universe. And if this kind of deep lore exploration is what you are here for, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss what comes next, because this story is only just getting started, and it gets significantly stranger before it gets any cleaner. Section 2. The Star Fort, the Theft, and the First Betrayal. The beginning of everything, the specific moment where the slow-burning fuse that Danyathos had laid across centuries finally caught flame and started burning toward the explosion, happened near the end of the 41st millennium. And it started, as so many things in the 41st millennium start, with a piece of bureaucracy and a convenient lie. The Soul Drinkers had lost the Soul Spear. Their flagship, a vessel called the Sanctifier, had been lost in a warp jump 1,000 years before the events we are now following, and the Soul Spear had been aboard it. For 1,000 years, the relic that Rogel Dorn had given them, as a symbol of their sacred purpose, had simply been gone, not destroyed, presumably. The warp does not reliably destroy things. It takes them somewhere else, somewhere that may or may not connect back to real space in any accessible way. 1,000 years is an enormous span of time, even for an organization that measures its history in millennia, and the loss had become a wound that the chapter carried quietly, but never stopped feeling. It was the absence at the center of everything they did, the missing thing that every warrior knew about and few spoke of directly. Then word came that the Soul Spear had been found. It was in the possession of the Van Scorvold Cartel, a criminal organization that had made its headquarters aboard an orbital defense platform above the planet Laconia. The Van Scorvolds were the kind of operation that proliferates in the darker corners of the Imperium's territory. People who had turned the complexity and inefficiency of imperial bureaucracy into a profitable business model. They trafficked in mutants, in proscribed artifacts, in things that official channels would not touch, but that powerful people throughout the Imperium were willing to pay to acquire through unofficial ones. Their Star Fort was their stronghold, and it was not a wholesome place. How the Soul Spear had moved from a lost flagship in the warp to the vault of a criminal cartel is one of those questions that the story never fully answers. The galaxy is vast and very old. Objects travel through it in ways that defy easy tracking. What matters is that someone knew where it was, and that someone was in a position to use that knowledge. The Adeptus Administratum, the enormous civilian bureaucracy managing the day-to-day administration of the Imperium, had been building a case against the Van Scorvold cartel for some time. They needed military forces for the action they wanted to take, and a consul named Clore deliberately leaked the information about the Soul Spear to ensure that the Soul Drinkers would participate enthusiastically rather than reluctantly. He understood the lever he was pressing. The chapter's attachment to its lost relic was the kind of motivation that would guarantee total commitment. He used it as a recruitment tool. 3 companies of Soul Drinkers deployed under Commander Kaon to take the Van Scorvold Star Fort. Among them was Librarian Sarpedon, who at this point was simply a specialist psyker officer within the chapter, not yet chapter master, not yet mutated into anything unusual, not yet any of the extraordinary things he would eventually become. He was, by the standards of the Soul Drinkers, an unremarkable officer in an otherwise standard operation. The assault began well. The Van Scorvold cartel's defenses were not designed to withstand Space Marines. They had hired guards, automated systems, private security forces, all of it meaningful against ordinary human opponents, and entirely insufficient against 300 warriors in power armor who had spent their entire military careers mastering the art of ship-to-ship assault. The Soul Drinkers moved with cold speed through the Star Fort, eliminating resistance, pushing toward the vault levels where the Soul Spear was supposedly stored. Commander Kaon was killed during the assault. Veritas Van Scorvold, a member of the criminal family, managed to inject him with a lethal xenotoxin in close quarters. Kaon had enough time to name Sarpedon as his successor and charge him with completing the mission before the poison did what poisons do. Sarpedon took command and pressed forward. They found it. In its vault, intact, ancient, humming with the particular energy that very old and very powerful warp-based technology tends to produce. 1,000 years missing, and here it was, exactly as described in the chapter's records. For the warriors standing in that vault, this moment would have felt like something sacred. The missing piece of what they were returned at last. Then, the Adeptus Mechanicus moved. The Mechanicus contingent that had been part of the Administratum's task force had never disclosed their actual intentions. The Soul Spear was an ancient vortex weapon of non-standard construction, and to the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose entire institutional purpose revolves around the study, preservation, and potential replication of ancient technology, it represented something extraordinary. They were not interested in it as a sacred relic belonging to a loyal chapter. They were interested in it as a piece of technology that might, with sufficient study, yield insights that could be applied elsewhere, and they were willing to steal it. A detachment of Skitarii, the Mechanicus's warrior servants, teleported directly into the vault at the precise moment of the Soul Drinker's recovery of the Soul Spear, and took it. The Archmagos commanding the Mechanicus contingent, a man named Kobatov, then deployed an artillery platform from his ship, and made the situation very clear. If the Soul Drinkers attempted to retaliate or pursue, the Star Fort would be destroyed. The Soul Spear was already being routed toward a Forge world. From the Mechanicus's perspective, the matter was concluded. You have to sit with this moment to understand why it affected the Soul Drinkers so deeply. This was not a military defeat at the hands of an enemy. This was betrayal by an ally, an institution of the same Imperium the Soul Drinkers had served faithfully for thousands of years, a member of the very task force they were part of. And that institution had, in one calculated and cold-blooded moment, violated every principle of honor that the chapter held sacred, stolen their most precious relic, and then threatened to kill them if they objected. The Catechism's marshal had an ideal environment to work in. Dine Yathos had written, buried within his philosophical sophistication, a framework that placed genuine service to the emperor's purpose above institutional compliance. He had written that the spirit of service mattered more than the letter of obedience. He had written about the gap between what the Imperium was supposed to be and what it often was. Now the Soul Drinkers were standing in a vault, watching that gap yawn wide in front of them, with their most sacred relic on the other side of it, in the hands of an institution that had just made clear it would rather arm a weapons platform against them than return what was theirs. Sarpedon improvised. During the tense standoff following the theft, Sarpedon was contacted by someone he had not been looking for. A man named Ysir had been a prisoner aboard the Star Fort, one of the many victims of the Van Scorvold cartel's mutant trafficking operation. He had escaped his captors and been hiding in the derelict maintenance sections of the station during the assault. He was not a soldier. He was not important in any obvious institutional sense. He described himself as a violent, petty thief who had stumbled into something he did not fully understand. He had been having visions. He believed they came from the Emperor. The entity speaking to him through those visions called itself the Architect of Fate. It told Ysir that Sarpedon was chosen, that the Soul Drinkers had a purpose greater than they knew, that they were being prepared for something. The visions were vivid and internally consistent, which is always worth noting with suspicion when you are dealing with anything touching the warp, because the warp is very good at producing internally consistent things that are not what they appear to be. Ysir showed Sarpedon a forgotten hangar bay in the Starfort's derelict sections, filled with ancient starfighters that nobody had catalogued or removed. Sarpedon used those starfighters to mount an attack on the Mechanicus artillery platform, seizing control of it. Tactically audacious, practically successful, but the Soul Spear was already gone, shipped to Forge World Code in Tertius, well beyond any possibility of immediate recovery. And in the process of fighting back, the Soul Drinkers had crippled multiple Imperial vessels, destroyed the Van Scorvold Star Fort, and then fled into an asteroid field when the combined fleets pursuing them became too large to safely engage. The Ordo Hereticus declared the Soul Drinkers excommunicate traitores, traitors, enemies of the Imperium. The full weight of that designation fell on them. Any Imperial institution had not just permission, but obligation to destroy them on sight, and no Imperial citizen should shelter them on pain of sharing their punishment. From a certain institutional perspective, this was logical. The Soul Drinkers had attacked other Imperial institutions. People were dead. Ships were damaged. A star fort was rubble. The label Excommunicate Traitoris did not carry nuance. It carried force. While hiding in the asteroid field, Chapter Master Gorgoleon arrived with the rest of the Soul Drinkers' fleet, having navigated through a warp route that had been closed for 600 years, labeled Route 931C in the chapter's navigation records. Gorgoleon was older than Sarpedon, more conservative, shaped by a lifetime of Orthodox chapter service. He understood institutional loyalty in a way that made Sarpedon's actions look like catastrophic overreach. Whatever the provocation, whatever injustice the Mechanicus had done, the correct response for a Space Marine chapter was not to attack other Imperial forces. The Inquisitor pursuing them had offered terms. Surrender, submit to punishment. The excommunication might be lifted. Gorgoleon wanted Sarpedon to take those terms. Sarpedon refused. The Catechism's marshal had done its work. Submission to an institution that had stolen from them and threatened their lives felt to Sarpedon like a betrayal of something more fundamental than institutional standing. He had been given a philosophical framework that placed genuine service above institutional compliance. And in that framework, kneeling felt like the wrong answer. More than wrong. It felt like becoming the very thing the Catechisms warned against, a warrior who obeyed forms rather than serving purposes. Gorgoleon challenged him. The Shield Rites, the Soul Drinkers' tradition for resolving such fundamental disputes, called for them to settle it in single combat. During that duel, something happened that nobody had any framework for. Sarpedon's body changed. 8 arachnid legs erupted from his lower torso, long and chitinous and powerful, the legs of something that would have been at home in a cave system rather than attached to a space marine. They emerged suddenly, fully formed, transforming the geometry of his movement entirely. He could now move along walls and ceilings. He could change direction with a speed that bipedal movement could never match. He could attack from angles that a standing fighter had no good way to defend against. He killed Gorgoleon with them. Then he stood there, covered in fresh mutation, over the body of the chapter master he had just killed, and the assembled veterans acclaimed him as their new leader. Not all of them. Some of the younger Marines and novices looked at a mutant standing over a dead predecessor and felt only horror. They barricaded themselves throughout the fleet and refused to follow. This became the First Chapter War, a brutal internal conflict that lasted months, as Sarpedon and loyal veterans hunted down the rebels section by section. More Soul Drinkers died fighting each other. The chapter that had gone to recover their relic had already lost warriors in the assault. Now, it lost more to the logic of its own civil war. By the time the fighting ended, the Soul Drinkers who remained were transformed in every possible sense, excommunicated, mutating, led by a librarian turned chapter master with 8 spider legs, their sacred relic still in the hands of those who had stolen it. And somewhere in the background, the entity calling itself the Architect of Fate continued to whisper through Yeezer's visions, offering guidance and purpose to a chapter that had just burned every bridge, connecting it to the institution it had served for thousands of years. Section 3. The Daemon's Gambit Abraxes, Vemeth, and Life on the Broken Back. When a Space Marine chapter goes renegade, it tends to follow recognizable patterns. They commit to the ruinous powers, or they run until caught, or they try to negotiate a return to legitimacy. The Soul Drinkers chose none of these paths. They chose a third option, one that the Imperium's categories had no good label for: loyal to the Emperor, hostile to the Imperium's institutional machinery, and committed to doing what they had always done, but without waiting for authorization from anyone. They needed somewhere to live. They abandoned their existing fleet, scuttling the ships that had served them for centuries. This was not a small thing. A fleet-based chapter lives in its ships, the way a homeworld chapter lives in its fortress monastery. Those vessels were as close to home as any of these warriors got. Scuttling them was a kind of burning of the past, a statement that there was no returning to what had been. They found a space hulk and claimed it. Space hulks are among the more impressive and horrible things that the warp produces. They are enormous conglomerations of vessels, sometimes dozens of ships from different eras and civilizations, fused together by the chaotic pressures of warp travel and expelled back into real space as a single massive structure that makes no internal architectural sense. They drift through the void as hazards to navigation, and to anyone unfortunate enough to investigate them. They are typically infested with gene stealers, daemons, and other things that colonize dark spaces where nobody normally goes. They are impossible to fully map. They shift and settle and groan with the pressure of materials that were never designed to be part of the same structure. To the soul drinkers, without a home world, excommunicated and hunted, the broken back was an option, which tells you something about the severity of their situation. The chapter's tech marine, a man named Ligris, was brilliant with machinery in the particular way that some people simply are, born to understand how things work and how to make them work better. He spent years learning the broken back's impossible internal geography, mapping corridors that curved for no structural reason, understanding which sections were stable and which were traps, coaxing the fused and contradictory systems of dozens of different ships into something approaching cooperative function. The broken back reportedly included components from imperial battleships, pleasure yachts, inquisitorial black ships, and alien vessel designs of non-human origin. One section was a working chapel from what had been a pilgrim ship. Another was a factory floor from what had been an ore processing vessel. Navigating it was like navigating a city built by people who did not agree on what a city was supposed to be. But Ligris made it work. And gradually the broken back became not just a functional base, but something approaching home. The chapter built their life around it, learned its rhythms, developed the specific knowledge of its layout that only long residence produces. It became theirs, in the way that places become yours when you have invested enough of your time and struggle into making them habitable. The architect of fate's visions then sent them on their first mission as renegades. Following Yeezer's guidance, the soul drinkers sought out a demon world, a place where reality had been so thoroughly corrupted by warp influence that it had essentially become a physical manifestation of a single daemon's consciousness. The daemon was Vameth, a prince of Nurgle. All things decay, all things break down and return to their constituent elements. Nurgle is the god of that process elevated to cosmic significance, and Vameth was one of his princes, his direct representatives in real space, a being whose power expressed itself through disease and the particular awful cheerfulness that Nurgle's servants display when doing what they were made for. Vameth had taken the form of a virus. Hundreds of ordinary people had been infected by something that was more than a disease, something using their bodies as vessels, replacing their consciousness with fragments of the daemon's own distributed mind. They were walking, breathing extensions of Vameth, and the planet they were on was slowly becoming an extension of his daemon world as the infection spread and more people joined the daemon's distributed presence. The soul drinkers went in anyway, because the vision said this needed doing. Because the Catechism's marshal had given them a framework that said doing the Emperor's work mattered more than whether that work was officially sanctioned. The battle was terrible. A daemon world does not follow normal physical laws. The ground was not entirely solid in the way that ground usually is. The atmosphere was not entirely breathable. The enemy was not entirely locatable in the way normal physical enemies are located, because Vameth's consciousness was distributed across hundreds of hosts simultaneously, and killing individual hosts reduced his power, but could not end the threat until the primary vessel, the host through which his attention was most fully focused, was reached and destroyed. The soul drinkers lost significant numbers fighting toward that core. These were warriors who had already survived the Starfort assault and the First Chapter War. And they still bled in Vameth's world because the environment itself was trying to kill them while the daemon's forces were. When Sarpedon finally found the primary host and drove the soul spear through it, the daemon's coherence broke apart. Victory, achieved at high cost, against a genuinely terrible foe. They had done the Emperor's work. Then they returned to the broken back, flushed with victory and the price of it. And Abraxas walked in. Abraxas was a daemon prince of Tsiench, the chaos god of change and manipulation, and the complex stewardship of events across time. He was not interested in the simple pleasures of immediate violence or decay. His power was built on the pleasure of watching pieces fall into place across plans that spanned centuries or millennia. He had been the architect of fate all along. He had been the entity speaking through Yeezer's visions. He had led the soul drinkers to Vameth, not because Vameth needed killing for any noble reason, but because Vameth was a Nurgle Daemon Prince and Abraxas was a Tzeentch Daemon Prince, and the two categories were natural rivals, and Abraxas had found a way to eliminate a competitor while expending none of his own forces. The Soul Drinkers had been his weapon, deployed without their knowledge or consent. He killed Ysir at this point, as punctuation. Opened a section of the broken back to space, and the man who had believed sincerely in what he was shown, who had genuinely thought he was serving the Emperor's purpose, died in the void without ever knowing what he had actually been part of. The casualness of it was the point, a demonstration of what Abraxas thought of the tools he used. Then he told them what he wanted in return for the Soul Spear, which he had obtained from the Forge World through his own means. He wanted the Soul Drinkers as his personal warband. He wanted them to serve Tzeentch, to become what some Space Marines become when their loyalty has nowhere else to go. Warriors devoted to a Chaos God, powerful and capable, and entirely redirected toward purposes they would have found abhorrent not long before. He expected Sarpedon to take the deal. Every pressure was in the right direction. The chapter was excommunicated. They had nowhere to go. They were mutating. Their purpose was unclear, and here was a cosmic being offering power, clarity, patronage, a place in something larger than themselves. Sarpedon drove the Soul Spear through Abraxas. He could not kill him. Daemon Princes cannot be truly killed in real space, only banished back to the warp where they eventually reform. But he drove the Soul Spear through the Daemon's manifested form and unleashed everything the weapon could do, and Abraxas was expelled back to the warp, and the Soul Drinkers had their relic in their hands and a clear answer to the question of whether they would serve Chaos. They would not. They would not serve the Imperium as it had become. They would not serve Chaos. They would serve the Emperor's actual purposes as they understood them, protecting those who needed protecting, fighting those who needed fighting, without waiting for authorization from hierarchies that had already declared them enemies. The mutations accelerated after this confrontation. The chapter's gene seed had been exposed to significant warp influence over the course of recent events, and that influence was manifesting physically in more and more warriors. Some grew scales, some developed extra eyes, some found their musculature changing in ways that implied something happening at a genetic level deeper than any standard treatment could reach. Chief Apothecary Pallas worked with everything at his disposal to understand and slow the process. He could stabilize some cases. He could halt progression in specific individuals. He could not reverse what had already occurred. Around 700 Astartes remained at this point. The chapter had started this whole catastrophe at something closer to a full 1,000 and had been grinding down steadily. 700 mutating renegade warriors in a stolen space hulk, rejected by the Imperium and having just rejected Chaos, and trying to find a third path that was neither of those things. That was the challenge before them. It seemed almost impossible. It almost was. Section 4. The Bleeding Chalice Tesseract, Stratix Luminae, and the Price of Survival. The most immediate threat the Soul Drinkers faced after refusing Abraxas was biological. The gene seed, the specific genetic material that defines what a Space Marine chapter is, and that is extracted from fallen warriors to create new ones, was destabilizing. If it remained unstable, they could not recruit. A chapter cannot sustain itself indefinitely without new warriors to replace those lost, and the attrition of battle meant that, without a way to stabilize the mutations, the Soul Drinkers would simply count down to zero regardless of how well they fought. The answer lay in a facility on a planetoid called Stratix Luminae. Before going renegade, the Soul Drinkers had been involved in a mission to an Adeptus Mechanicus research facility that had been studying how to halt and reverse mutations in subjects exposed to warp influence. The research had been legitimate in scope, even if conducted with Mechanicus thoroughness in its disregard for the conventional limits of safe experimentation. The facility on Stratix Luminae had been collecting data that might eventually allow the kinds of changes that warp exposure produced to be understood and controlled. Then, an Eldar raid had destroyed the facility, and one of the test subjects had escaped. His name was Tesseract. He had been a mutant psyker before the experiments, already more than baseline human in his psychic capabilities, and the modifications conducted on him before the Eldar attack had pushed him into territory that no human body should be able to survive. He had survived anyway, and the ruinous powers, specifically Nurgle, had found him and recognized in him an extraordinarily promising candidate for elevation. Tesseract had become a champion of Nurgle without entirely understanding that this was what had happened. He thought he was evolving into a higher form of being on his own terms. He was being consumed by something that found his delusions useful. Over the years since his escape, Tesseract had built an empire, a literal empire, controlling agri-worlds and hive cities and forge worlds and smaller strategic assets, millions of human beings under the control of something that thought of itself as a god emperor. The plague he spread, carrying fragments of his distributed will, was how he expanded his domain. Worlds that accepted it became his. People who caught it became his instruments. The data from the Stratix Luminae facility, the research conducted before the Eldar destroyed it, was scattered across several of the worlds now under Tesseract's control. The researchers and tech priests who had survived the raid had fled to different planets as the situation deteriorated, and the data existed in fragments across multiple locations. Getting all of it required, going into Tesseract's empire, world by world, finding the surviving Mechanicus personnel, recovering what they knew, all while being hunted by Inquisitor Thaddeus, whose task force was specifically assigned to capture or destroy the Soul Drinkers, and who was competent enough at his work to make the pursuit genuinely dangerous. Thaddeus is worth dwelling on for a moment, because he represents something unusual in this story. He was hunting the Soul Drinkers, committed to the mission, doing his job with professional seriousness. But he was also intelligent enough to pay careful attention to what he was actually observing as he pursued them. The Soul Drinkers he was watching were not behaving like conventional Chaos Space Marines. They were not despoiling the worlds they moved through. They were not turning populations to service of the Dark Gods. When they encountered civilians in danger, they protected them. When they encountered genuine threats to human populations, they fought those threats, regardless of whether it served their own strategic interests. He was looking at warriors who had been declared traitors, and finding that the specific behaviors he associated with traitors were largely absent. This moral uncertainty did not prevent him from pursuing them. He continued the mission, but it planted doubt that would eventually become important. The Soul Drinkers moved through Tesseract's empire carefully, collecting data fragments, fighting his zombie plague soldiers and corrupted champions, using every tactical resource available, all while continuing to mutate. All while their numbers decreased, every engagement cost warriors they could not replace. On Stratix Luminae itself, they finally cornered the last pieces of the data they needed. Tesseract intervened personally, destroying his own flagship in orbit and raining the debris down onto the planet's surface to crush the Soul Drinkers under sheer material weight. It was an extreme tactical decision that said something about Tesseract's state of mind. The willingness to destroy something enormously valuable in order to eliminate enemies he had started to see as a specific, significant threat. Sarpedon and Thaddeus ended up working together to bring Tesseract down. Sarpedon used the psychic ability he called the Hell, the power that manifested mass psychic illusion, targeting the deepest fears of every mind within range, to stun Tesseract long enough for Thaddeus to act. Then Sarpedon extinguished Tesseract's soul with a direct psychic assault, ending the mutant's empire and his extended and tormented existence simultaneously. A renegade chapter master and an inquisitor who was supposed to be arresting him, working together because neither could solve the problem alone. It was not a comfortable alliance. Neither party was happy about what it implied. But it worked. The data was recovered. Pallas eventually used it to stabilize the chapter's gene seed. The chapter had a biological future again, but leaving Stratix Luminae cost them Telos. Assault Sergeant Telos had been among the finest close combat warriors in the chapter before everything went wrong. At the Van Scorvold Star Fort, he had lost both hands to an Adeptus Mechanicus electro-priest during the fighting, and the nerve damage was so severe that bionic replacements could not be properly integrated. Rather than accept the loss of his combat capability, Telos had something more drastic done. Chain blades were grafted directly into the stumps. The mutation reshaping his body held them in place and gave him a healing factor so extreme that almost any wound closed within minutes. His mutated muscular system gave him strength beyond a normal Marine. In close combat, he had become something extraordinary and terrifying, a whirling mass of bladed arms and healing flesh that very little could stop. The problem was what was happening behind his eyes. The mutations were not only physical, his neurochemistry was changing. The aggression that had made him an excellent assault marine was being amplified into something that was no longer compatible with discipline or purpose. He had been increasingly difficult to command, increasingly extending engagements beyond what tactical necessity required, seemingly needing the fighting in a way that made him dangerous to ally with, as well as to fight against. When the Soul Drinkers had to extract from Stratix Luminae, they could not get Telos and his assault squad out. The logistics of the extraction, the pressure of Tetarak's forces, meant a choice was made. Telos was fighting when the extraction happened, taking on impossible numbers of Tetarak's undead in the kind of close combat that he had been born for. He chose to keep fighting, rather than pull back. The Soul Drinkers left without him. They assumed he was probably dead. He was not dead. Several years later, Sarpedon received word that Telos had wiped Stratix Luminae clean. Every person who had survived the war on that world, every refugee and individual trying to build something afterward, had been killed. Telos had pledged himself to Khorne, whose devotion to pure violence, without purpose or limit, was the natural end state of everything the mutations had been building toward in him for years. He was now wandering through the region, killing. A Khornate champion who had once been marked for captaincy within a chapter that was trying to protect the people the Imperium forgot, Sarpedon made finding him a priority. Not strategic priority, personal priority. Because Telos had been his warrior, his responsibility, and whatever Telos had become had its roots in the choices made under Sarpedon's leadership. The new Marines recruited, after Pallas stabilized the gene seed, were trained differently than their predecessors. Sarpedon believed in free minds. He believed that warriors who chose their path with genuine understanding were better warriors than those whose personalities had been reshaped through hypno-indoctrination to make obedience feel natural. He wanted soul drinkers who thought for themselves, who had genuine reasons for the choices they made. This was a beautiful philosophy. It was also, as would eventually become clear, a decision that would come back and tear the chapter apart from within. Section 5. Crimson Tears and Dark Eldar Schemes. The End of Telos. The hunt for Telos eventually brought the Soul Drinkers to Endymion 4, which was simultaneously the site of a Dark Eldar operation on a scale that threatened the entire planet. The Drukhari had been cultivating a secret army beneath the city, mutated human slaves waiting for the signal to rise, and when they did, the slaughter they would cause was intended to attract demonic attention so profound that it would transform the entire world into a daemon world, the Dark Eldar, planned to claim as a secondary home. Their territory in the webway had certain limitations. A physical daemon world they controlled would offer complementary capabilities. The Soul Drinkers were not there to stop this plan. They were there for Telos, but the forces present for different reasons inevitably intersected. The Crimson Fists were also involved. Captain Rhinez had lost his company's battle standard to the Soul Drinkers in an earlier encounter, and the loss of a company standard in Space Marine culture is not a minor embarrassment. A standard is a record of the company's history, the names of its fallen, the honors earned through campaigns spanning decades or centuries. Losing it to a renegade chapter was the kind of shame that a Marine carried indefinitely. Rhinez wanted the Soul Drinkers destroyed, and his feelings on the matter had moved from professional to intensely personal. Sarpedon divided his remaining forces to manage the overlapping situation. Part provided cover for the Imperial Guard regiments present, not because the Imperium deserved their help, but because those individual guardsmen were human beings in immediate danger. Part hunted for Telos in the city's chaotic streets. Soul Drinkers scouts eventually located Telos, who was fighting his way through an Imperial Guard regiment with the absolute commitment that Khornate champions bring to violence. Everything that Telos had been, the skill, the aggression, the terrifying physical capability, was still present. What was gone was anything resembling control or purpose beyond the act of killing itself. Chaplain Ictinos and his warriors held Telos's forces in place long enough for Sarpedon to arrive. The duel between them carried the weight of everything the chapter had been, and everything it had become. Two former brothers on a bridge, above a burning city, one driven by a chaos, God's hunger for blood, and the other driven by grief and responsibility, and the obligation that commanders feel toward warriors they failed to save. Sarpedon barely won, collapsing sections of the bridge to bury Telos under falling debris, and the evacuation was already underway. The Inquisition declared exterminatus on Endymion 4 rather than deal with the complexity of everything happening there. The entire world was purged from orbit. Telos died in that fire. The planet's entire population died. And the Soul Drinkers had used the Crimson Fists during this engagement, tricking them through carefully managed intelligence into attacking the Dark Eldar stronghold, preventing the Daemon World conversion, but also once again humiliating Rhaenys in a way that left his fury toward the Soul Drinkers burning hotter than ever. This pattern of accomplishing necessary things through means that created lasting enemies characterized much of the Soul Drinkers' renegade existence. They were not evil, but they were not entirely good either. They operated in the moral gray that necessity produces, and each thing they did to survive left marks that would eventually become the case against them. Section 6. The Second Chapter War. Eumenes' Rebellion and Internal Collapse. The new generation of Soul Drinkers, recruited after Pallas stabilized the Gene Seed, had grown up with the renegade life as their only experience of what being Astartes meant. They were trained by the survivors of everything that had gone before, given the Catechism's Martial as their philosophical foundation, and deliberately left without hypno-indoctrination because Sarpedon believed in free minds. They were smart, capable warriors who thought for themselves. Scout Sergeant Eumenes was their voice. He had come from a world where the Imperium had stripped every extractable resource and then abandoned the population to deal with the consequences on their own. His hatred of the Imperium was not philosophical in the way Sarpedon's was, rooted in intellectual arguments about institutional corruption. Eumenes' hatred was personal and visceral. He had seen what imperial indifference did to actual people, to communities trying to sustain themselves after the Imperium had taken everything it could use. He had also been watching Sarpedon's leadership decisions carefully, and what he saw concerned him. Missions accomplished, but at costs that seemed greater than the gains. A chapter that kept getting smaller no matter how well it fought. A chapter master whose philosophical vision was, in Eumenes' assessment, too detached from the practical reality of what the Soul Drinkers needed to do to survive. The world of Vanquales, a shrine world with complex political entanglements, became the flashpoint. The local population believed the Soul Drinkers were connected to a terrorist organization called the Black Chalice and the Howling Griffins, a chapter obsessively committed to fulfilling every oath, regardless of tactical wisdom, arrived in force. The Howling Griffins were the kind of warriors who would fulfill a commitment even if fulfilling it was clearly going to result in disaster, because the alternative, breaking an oath, was worse to them than any practical consequence. This made them extremely reliable and occasionally very difficult to coordinate with. During the chaos on Vanquales, Eumenes forced the issue. He had built support among the newer Marines over months, and he moved against Sarpedon with enough force to succeed. He formed an unexpected and temporary alliance with the Howling Griffin's chief librarian Mercano, a powerful psyker who had his own reasons for wanting Sarpedon's power ended. The two of them engaged Sarpedon in a psychic duel of enormous scale, recreating the battlefields and worlds they had experienced as the environment of their mental conflict shifted and roiled. Mercano ultimately won the psychic battle, exhausting Sarpedon to the point of incapacity. Eumenes then killed Mercano before the Howling Griffin's librarian could deliver the killing blow on Sarpedon. He had used one of the most powerful psykers available to his cause as a weapon and discarded him when the weapon had served its purpose. Sarpedon was thrown in the Brokenback's brig. Eumenes was chapter master. This did not last. Ligris had been working against Eumenes from within the Brokenback systems, sabotaging and delaying where opportunities presented themselves. Faithful to Sarpedon in the way that people who know each other very well are faithful, through practical action rather than declarations. Sarpedon escaped through a series of events involving Scamander, a scout with latent psychic potential that Sarpedon was able to exploit, and made his way to the bridge of the Brokenback. Eumenes faced him there with both the Soul Spear and the Force Axe he had taken from Mercano, two powerful weapons in capable hands. But Sarpedon's 8 arachnid legs changed the geometry of the fight in ways that combat training based on fighting Space Marines did not fully prepare a warrior for. When your opponent can attack from any surface in the room simultaneously, from above and below, and at angles that human and even enhanced human movement cannot track. The assumptions built into your training become partly irrelevant. Sarpedon killed Eumenes and won back the chapter he had won from Gorgolion. He offered those who had followed Eumenes the right to leave. Most of the scout generation and newer Marines took that option. The chapter fell to 250 warriors. Chaplain Ictinos had been present throughout the entire Civil War, advising, counseling, steering decisions with the calm authority of a spiritual guide. His advice was consistently reasonable in presentation, thoughtful in content, apparently devoted to the chapter's well-being. Nobody had any reason to doubt him. He was the last chaplain, the keeper of the chapter's spiritual health. He was also serving something else entirely. He had been for a very long time. On his advice, the diminished soul drinkers flew the Broken Back to the veiled regions at the galaxy's rim, into unknown space, toward what would prove to be their final campaign. Section 7. The Veiled Regions, the Necrons, and the End of the Road. The Veiled Regions were relatively unmapped stretches of space at the galaxy's rim, territory that the Imperium's cartographers had noted existed without dedicating significant resources to surveying. Space is enormous. Even the Imperium, with its tens of thousands of worlds and vast administrative apparatus, cannot attend to everything simultaneously. The Veiled Regions existed as a placeholder on the maps, indicating that something was there, but nobody had looked carefully at what. What the Soul Drinkers found there was troubling. The Veiled Regions had human populations, or rather, they had human infrastructure. The physical evidence that human populations had been established, some of them for centuries, settlements, agricultural systems, the bones of communities developed over generations, but no people. World after world showed the same pattern. The infrastructure was intact. The people were gone. Not war, not plague, not chaos corruption. Something systematic and quiet had come through the Veiled Regions and removed the human presence from every world it touched. As methodically as someone clearing a garden of plants, they want gone before planting something new. Necrons. The Necrontyr were an ancient civilization, older than humanity's recorded history, that had made a catastrophic transaction with the Citan, those star-sized entities of unimaginable power, in exchange for bodies of living metal that would not decay and would not break down. The soul transfer did not go as planned. What emerged were mechanisms with the structure of what the Necrontyr had been, and a drastically diminished inner life, functional undead in the engineering sense, designed to last forever, and efficient at that design. They had slept for 60 million years in vast tomb complexes beneath worlds they had claimed during their civilization's height. They were waking now in the 41st millennium, methodically reclaiming territory they considered their ancient property. The human populations of the Veiled Regions had simply been in the way. The Soul Drinkers encountered an Adeptus Mechanicus explorator fleet that had been investigating the same mystery. After initial hostility, practical necessity created a temporary alliance. Neither force could handle the Necron threat alone, and the Mechanicus were willing to set aside the Soul Drinkers' excommunicate traitorous status long enough to work together. On the tomb world of Waaaagh, where the core of the Necron activity in the region was concentrated, the battle reached its most intense point. Ligris, the tech marine, who had kept the Broken Back functional for years, made contact with the Necron overlord, controlling the region. Mental contact through the Broken Back systems, a connection that gave him a genuine understanding of the alien frame of reference through which the Necron experienced the world. He also understood what it would take to stop the Necron threat, and he chose to sacrifice himself to do it. He destroyed the Citan fragment that was powering the Necron operations, and he did not survive the act. The Soul Drinkers lost Ligris on Waaaagh, the man who had made the Broken Back habitable, the engineer of their practical survival, one of the original warriors who had been there since the very beginning at the Van Scorvold Star Fort. And the chapter that had been at approximately 700 warriors when everything started had, by the end of the Waaaagh campaign, been ground down to barely 100. The Imperial Fists arrived. Captain Lysander of their first company, one of the most formidable individuals the Imperium produces at the captain level, engaged Sarpedon in single combat and won. The Soul Drinkers were captured. The Broken Back was abandoned. They were taken aboard the Phalanx, in chains, to face whatever judgment awaited them. After decades of surviving everything the galaxy could produce, they were finally caught. The question was whether caught meant destroyed. Section 5.5. Endymion 4, Telos, and the cost of being right too late. Before we leave the middle period of the Soul Drinker's story, there is one chapter of it that deserves its own extended treatment. Because one of the things that makes this saga genuinely affecting, rather than simply dramatic, is that its most tragic thread is not about betrayal or manipulation. It is about friendship. About a warrior, the chapter failed, not through malice, but through the specific kind of failure that comes from not having enough time and not being able to fight every battle simultaneously. Telos. Remember him. He had been among Sarpedon's closest inner circle before the mutations accelerated in ways that could not be managed. His mutations went further than those of the other Soul Drinkers, expressing themselves in extremity that pushed him past the threshold where anyone could pretend he was simply a space marine who happened to look different. He became something else. Not chaos-touched in the conventional sense, not a servant of any of the dark gods, but a being transformed by forces Pallas could not counter quickly enough, into a shape that the chapter's own capabilities could not accommodate. He was left behind on Stratix Luminae when the Soul Drinkers departed after dealing with Tesseract, not abandoned callously. Left behind because there was no other option that could have worked. Taking him along in the state he was in would have created problems. The chapter did not have the capacity to solve, and there was a belief, perhaps genuine, perhaps self-serving, that the genetic stabilization techniques they had recovered would eventually be applicable to his case if they could return. They never returned. And Telos, alone on a world that had become a battlefield and then a charnel house, had nothing to work with except the mutations that had remade him and the cornate influence that the blood god's proximity makes inevitable for beings of sufficient violence, who exist without the social architecture that gives violence, direction, and purpose. Khorne does not require devotion. Khorne requires blood. And a being of Telos's capability, alone, mutating further, with nothing to ground him to anything outside himself, gave the blood god exactly what the blood god needed to claim him. When the Soul Drinkers encountered him on Endymion 4, what had once been their brother was now a cornate champion. A being shaped for killing above all else, with a retinue of similarly transformed figures, having worked his way across systems pursuing violence that satisfied the blood hunger that had replaced everything else that had once made him who he was. The population of an entire world had been wiped out during his passage through it. Not strategically, not for any purpose that could be described in terms of goals and intentions, simply because they were there, and he was what he had become. The encounter on Endymion 4 was deeply uncomfortable for Sarpedon. This was someone he had known, someone who had fought beside him, someone whose voice he recognized in whatever distorted form it still emerged, someone who had been part of the original group that had made the decision at the Van Scorvold Star Fort that set everything in motion. He bore some responsibility for what Telos had become, not in the sense of having chosen it, but in the sense of having made choices along the way that contributed to the outcome, including the choice to leave him on Stratix Luminae. The Soul Drinkers could not save Telos. There was nothing left to save in any meaningful sense. What Telos had become did not want saving. What Telos had become wanted battle, and Sarpedon gave him battle, and in the middle of a fight that the chapter could not fully control, the Imperium made the determination that Endymion IV needed an exterminatus. The Death Guard were also present on the world, pursuing their own agenda around the Poxwalker slave population, and the combination of chaos forces, ongoing conflict, and a world that had already suffered catastrophic losses made the exterminatus call logical by imperial reasoning. The planet burned. Telos died in it. Inquisitor Thaddeus, who had been pursuing the Soul Drinkers since the Stratix Luminae campaign, watched them throughout the Endymion 4 engagement and continued updating his assessment of what they actually were. He had begun the hunt as a true believer in the simple categories: excommunicate traitores, servants of chaos, enemies of the Imperium who needed to be destroyed. The problem was that the more closely he watched them, the more the evidence refused to match those categories. He saw them fight against chaos. He saw them protect populations that the Imperium's own forces had effectively abandoned. He saw them make the decisions that people dedicated to human survival make, rather than the decisions that servants of the dark powers make. He filed no report recommending their protection. He had no formal mechanism for doing what he was beginning to think might be the right thing, which was acknowledging that the simple categories had produced the wrong answer in this case. But he did not press the hunt with the intensity that the letter of his mandate required. And he did not shoot Sarpedon when he had the opportunity on Endymion IV, which was a choice he made in the middle of a firefight, quickly, without time to reason through it formally, but a choice that tells you something about where his assessment of the Soul Drinkers had arrived by that point. Thaddeus is one of the more interesting figures in the Soul Drinkers story precisely because he does exactly what good inquisitors are supposed to do. He looks at the evidence. He updates his conclusions based on what he observes, rather than what he was told. He finds that the conclusions he was supposed to reach are not the conclusions the evidence supports, and he lives with the discomfort of that gap between official mandate and observed reality, without resolving it dishonestly in either direction. He never exonerated the Soul Drinkers. He never declared them loyalists or allies. But he also never stopped wondering whether the Imperium's institutional response to them had been simply and straightforwardly wrong, and whether the cost of that wrongness had been paid mostly by the Soul Drinkers themselves, who would have fought for the Emperor their whole lives if the opportunity had existed. It did not exist. And by the time the trial on the Phalanx created the closest thing to a formal hearing the Soul Drinkers would ever receive, most of the warriors who had formed the original chapter were dead, and the handful who remained were there to be judged rather than to receive any kind of recognition for what they had actually done across their decades of existence outside the institutional walls of the Imperium. The philosophical foundation. What the catechisms Marshall actually said. To understand the Soul Drinkers, you need to spend some time with the text that shaped them. The Catechisms Marshall by Dionysios was not propaganda in the crude sense. It was not a document telling its readers that the Imperium was corrupt and they should betray it. That kind of direct instruction would have been identified and suppressed within a generation of the text's composition. Dionysios was too careful and too patient for anything so obvious. Instead, the Catechisms Martial was a genuine philosophical work, a serious engagement with questions about the nature of honor, the relationship between warriors and the people they serve, the proper foundation of loyalty, and the conditions under which obedience to authority represented genuine service to humanity versus simply perpetuating a system. Its core argument, presented carefully and never made explicit in ways that would trigger censors, was something like this. A Space Marine's ultimate loyalty is to the Emperor and to humanity, not to the institutions that claim to act in the Emperor's name. The Emperor himself is beyond question, but the High Lords of Terra, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the various arms of imperial bureaucracy, these are human constructions, capable of corruption, capable of drift from their founding purposes, capable of demanding things that harm the very people they exist to protect. A warrior who obeys a corrupt institution because it claims authority is not serving the Emperor. A warrior who refuses a corrupt institution and fights for the Emperor's actual purposes is serving something real, regardless of what the institutional record says about their status. The danger of this argument is not that it is wrong. The danger is that it is right, and right in ways that create a framework with no clear stopping point. Once you have established that institutional authority is not the final arbiter of rightness, you have created the intellectual architecture for any action that can be justified by appeal to the Emperor's true purposes, as understood by the person making the decision. Who decides when an institution has become corrupt enough to reject? The individual warrior, apparently. With what guidance? Their own conscience and the tradition of asking the question that the Catechisms Martial had instilled. Dionysios understood this. He was not naive about the implications. He had built a text that was genuinely wise and genuinely dangerous simultaneously, and the wisdom was what made it spread and be taken seriously and shape the character of thousands of warriors across thousands of years, while the danger was what made those warriors eventually breakable in exactly the way Dionysios intended. The specific genius of it, and it was genius in the coldest and most terrible sense, was that the text did not produce fanatics. It produced careful thinkers, warriors who genuinely wrestled with questions of ethics and obligation, and came to their conclusions through real reasoning rather than simple indoctrination. This made the conclusions feel earned rather than imposed, which made them more durable than any direct programming could have achieved. You cannot talk someone out of a conclusion they reach themselves through the kind of reasoning they trust. You can only offer them new information and hope they update. Dinyathos had calculated that the information that would arrive when the Soul Drinkers' break with the Imperium finally came would not update them toward compliance, and he was right. The theft of the Soul Spear, the betrayal by the Mechanicus and by the chapter master who counseled submission in the face of it, was the kind of concrete, specific institutional failure that the Catechism's Marshal had prepared them to see coming. It confirmed what the text had taught them to watch for. It activated the framework. The irony is that the Soul Drinkers who broke from the Imperium were not wrong about the Imperium. The Imperium really had failed them. The Adeptus Mechanicus really had stolen their sacred relic. The official response really was to declare them enemies for objecting. Every element of the specific situation matched the general pattern that the Catechism's Marshal had described. The practical conclusions they drew were reasonable, given the framework they had been given to reason with. They were right about the Imperium. They were wrong about Dinyathos. And those two facts existed simultaneously for their entire renegade existence, making their story more complicated and more honest than a straightforward tale of fall or redemption could have been. The voice in the visions, Abraxas and the Architect of Fate. We should also spend more time with Abraxas, because the Daemon Prince of Tzianch, who spent decades manipulating the Soul Drinkers through the visions of Chaplain Yeezer, is one of the more interesting antagonists in the story. And his role goes beyond simple villainy into something that illuminates the particular horror of Tzianch as a chaos power. Tzianch is the god of change, of mutation, of scheming, of the infinite proliferation of plans and counterplans and counter-counterplans that make the labyrinthine politics of the chaos gods particularly exhausting to map. Tzianch loves complexity. Tzianch loves webs of conspiracy that stretch across centuries. Tzianch loves the moment when someone realizes that what they thought was their own plan was actually a thread in someone else's design, a design so much larger than their frame of reference that they could not have seen it from within their own perspective. Abraxas was not the Architect of Fate in the sense of having designed everything from the beginning. He was the Architect of Fate in the sense that he worked with whatever material was available, finding the patterns that could be exploited, the gaps in existing structures that a careful push could open into fractures, the individuals whose specific vulnerabilities aligned with his needs. Yeezer was one such individual. The chaplain was a man of genuine faith and genuine vision, and the visions were real. That is the specific horror of Tzianch-based manipulation. The daemon does not simply implant false information. It works with something genuine, something true, and shapes the interpretation of that truth in ways that serve its purposes. Yeezer's visions pointed toward real events, real threats, real opportunities. The direction they pointed in happened to be the direction Abraxas needed the Soul Drinkers to move. The Soul Drinkers were led to Vameth by genuine spiritual guidance. Vameth was a real Daemon Prince of Nurgle and a real threat to real people. The Soul Drinkers' destruction of Vameth was a genuine act of service to humanity. And it was also exactly what Abraxas needed to remove his divine competition, Nurgle's champion in that region being both his rival and an obstacle to the plan Abraxas had constructed. Both things were simultaneously true. This is the texture of Tzianch's work. Nothing is simply false. Everything means something, accomplishes something real, points towards something genuine. The manipulation lies not in the content of the visions, but in the selection of which truths to reveal and which to withhold, and in the framework that makes the selected truths lead toward the desired conclusions. When Abraxas revealed himself after Vameth's destruction, he expected the Soul Drinkers to see the logic of what he was offering. They had been set up for this moment. They were outside the Imperium, hunted by its forces, mutating into shapes that made any return to official acceptance increasingly unlikely. The cause they were fighting for was real. The enemies they were opposing were genuine. The offer Abraxas made was, from a certain angle, simply the completion of what they were already doing, with a sponsor who could provide resources and protection the Renegade chapter badly needed. Sarpedon drove the Soul Spear through him. What makes this moment work is not that Sarpedon had been untouched by the years of manipulation. He had been shaped by the Catechism's Marshal and by the arc Abraxas had helped steer him along. He knew this, at least partially. And he drove the soul spear through the daemon anyway, because the specific thing Abraxas was asking for, formal service to chaos, formal acknowledgement that the dark powers were what the soul drinkers were serving, crossed a line that the Catechism's marshal had also drawn clearly. They were servants of the Emperor, not of human institutions that claimed to speak for the Emperor, not of alien intelligences that claimed to be helping the Emperor's purposes. The Emperor himself and the people who needed the Emperor's protection. Abraxas was banished. He would return for the final act, serving Dionysios' plan, and would be banished again when Leuco held him long enough for the warp gate to be sealed. He lost twice to the chapter he had spent decades cultivating as a tool, which would be amusing if anything about the situation were actually funny. The Broken Back, a home that shouldn't have worked. No discussion of the Soul Drinkers is complete without spending real time on the Broken Back, because the ship itself is one of the story's most distinctive elements and speaks to something important about what the chapter had become. The Broken Back was not designed to be a chapter's home. It was a collection of ships. Specifically, a collection of ships that had been fused together by the energies of a warp transit gone badly wrong, producing a conglomerate vessel that should, by rights, have been completely non-functional. Individual ships had their own internal logic, their own systems, their own structural assumptions about which direction was up and which spaces were designed for what purposes. Fusing them together created a structure full of contradictions, corridors that led to walls, rooms that had two different gravitational orientations, life support systems that had been designed for ships with different populations, making demands on their recycling capacity, power conduits that ran from systems that no longer existed to systems that did not need them. Ligris spent years making this work. He was the tech marine who understood both the mechanical logic of the individual ship systems and the organic logic of the whole structure that had emerged from their collision, and he worked constantly to maintain the Broken Back's functionality against the entropy that the ship's fundamental contradictions were always imposing. He knew every system. He knew which corridors were structurally sound and which ones were not, which were safe enough for regular use, which ones were safe enough for emergency use only. He knew the Broken Back the way a doctor knows a complicated patient, not just the textbook description of how it should function, but the specific way this particular system worked, given its history and its damage, and its long accumulation of workarounds. The Broken Back became the Soul Drinker's home in the fullest sense. It was strange and difficult, and full of places that should not have worked but did, held together by continuous, careful attention rather than original good design. That description applied to the chapter itself at every point in its renegade existence. They were making something functional from components that had not been designed to work together, in conditions that were not meant to support what they were trying to do, held together by the continuous attention of people who understood the system they were maintaining and cared about keeping it running. When the Soul Drinkers were captured and the Broken Back was abandoned in the Veiled Regions, the ship continued to drift. It did not immediately fall apart. Ligris had built too much redundancy into it for a simple loss of crew to cause immediate catastrophic failure. In the years following the Battle of the Phalanx, the Broken Back presumably continues its drift somewhere in space, empty now, a monument to decades of renegade existence, to the people who kept it running and died aboard it and built something in it that could not have been planned and cannot be replicated. That is exactly the right ending for a ship like that. What renegade actually means in the context of the Soul Drinkers? The Imperium has several formal categories for Space Marine chapters that deviate from expected norms. Excommunicate Tritoris is the most severe, declaring a chapter the formal enemy of the Imperium and authorizing all Imperial forces to engage them on sight. This is the status the Soul Drinkers carried from the Starfort incident onward. But the practical meaning of that status in the Soul Drinkers' case was strange, because they were not actually doing what Excommunicate Tritoris chapters typically do. They were not raiding Imperial worlds for resources. They were not spreading chaos, corruption, or worshipping the dark gods. They were not recruiting through coercion or making war on civilian populations. They were fighting chaos. They were protecting people who needed protecting. They were acting, in terms of what they were actually doing on a day-to-day basis, as Space Marines were supposed to act. This created a situation where the chapter's official status and their actual behavior were completely disconnected from each other. The Inquisition was obligated to pursue them based on the official status. Inquisitor Thaddeus found himself pursuing warriors who were doing the emperor's work, being paid in coin that made no sense given the work itself. The cognitive dissonance of that situation is part of what drives Thaddeus's gradual reconsideration of what the Soul Drinkers actually are. There is something in the Soul Drinkers' situation that resonates with historical cases of institutions declaring individuals enemies for failing to comply with institutional demands, regardless of whether those demands were themselves legitimate. The church that excommunicates the reformer, the state that imprisons the whistleblower, the guild that blacklists the worker who reported safety violations. The pattern is recognizable. The institution's self-preservation mechanism treats those who challenge its authority as enemies, regardless of whether the challenge is being made in service of the institution's stated values or against them. The Soul Drinkers challenge the Imperium's authority while serving the Emperor's values. That is the specific irony at the heart of their story, and it is why the conclave on the Phalanx was so uncomfortable for everyone who attended it with any honesty. They had to look at a chapter that had been declared enemies and find a way to honestly assess whether that declaration had reflected reality. And the honest answer was not simple. The gene seed question: what the Soul Drinkers might actually be. The revelation about the Soul Drinkers' gene seed is one of the most tantalizing threads in the whole story, and it is worth spending extended time considering what it might mean, with appropriate flags that much of this is speculative inference from canon evidence rather than confirmed lore. The two lost Primarchs are among the biggest mysteries in Warhammer 40,000. The 2nd and 11th Legions, their names, their Primarchs, and the specific circumstances of their removal from history are among the most heavily redacted topics in the setting. What we know is that they existed, that they served during the Great Crusade alongside their brothers, that something happened, and that they and all record of them were purged from the official histories with a thoroughness that suggests organized, deliberate removal rather than simple loss of records over time. The Imperium forgets things. The 15,000 years between the Horus Heresy and the 41st millennium involved wars, warp storms, technological decline, and administrative collapse on scales that genuinely destroyed information that was never recovered. Simple forgetting is normal and expected. But the lost Primarchs are not forgotten in the way that peripheral information is forgotten. Their absence is clean in a way that looks deliberate. The slot where they should appear in the records is empty in ways that suggest not neglect, but active removal. Various theories exist. One holds that the Primarchs were purged because they or their legions committed atrocities significant enough that the Emperor determined their removal from the historical record was preferable to acknowledging what had happened. One holds that they were corrupted by chaos before the Horus Heresy proper, making their fall an earlier episode that had to be hidden lest it undermine the mythology being constructed around the Primarchs as a concept. One holds that they were removed because their genetic work produced results that were dangerous in ways that needed to be contained, that their specific gene seed created Astartes with capabilities or tendencies that the Imperium could not safely acknowledge. That last theory intersects interestingly with the Soul Drinkers, a chapter that produces warriors constitutionally inclined to question authority. Warriors, shaped by their genetic heritage, to be morally independent in ways that the Imperium's compliance-focused institutional culture cannot easily accommodate. Warriors who are, in the most consistent and genuine sense, servants of the Emperor rather than servants of the institution, which turns out to be a meaningful distinction when the institution fails. If one of the lost Primarchs had been purged precisely because they held this kind of philosophy, because they believed in fighting for humanity rather than for the Imperium as an institution, because they told the Emperor something the Emperor found uncomfortably close to a critique of the whole project, then their successors, bearing those philosophical tendencies in their genetic inheritance, would be problematic in ways that the Imperium's classification systems were not designed to manage. You cannot put excommunicate traitoris on a philosophical orientation. You can only put it on a chapter when they act on that orientation in ways that create an official record to respond to. The Soul Spear's genetic keying adds weight to this. If Rogal Dorn had genuinely given the Soul Drinkers a weapon from his personal history, that weapon being keyed to Rogal Dorn's genetic signature would make more sense than being keyed specifically to the soul drinkers. The most logical explanation for a weapon that responds only to the soul drinker's specific and unusual genetic profile is that it was made for them specifically by someone with that profile, who knew their lineage and wanted to give them something that would serve them, rather than anyone who claimed to have authority over them. That reading makes the soul spear a gift from their actual progenitor, hidden behind the cover story of Rogal Dorn's generosity, kept safe across thousands of years, because its genetic keying made it impossible for anyone else to use, regardless of how many times it was stolen or lost. And it makes the quest to recover the soul spear from the Van Scorvold fort a story not about reclaiming a trophy from their adoptive parents' legacy, but about recovering something authentically their own that the Imperium was holding on their behalf without being honest about whose it really was. All of this is speculation. The canon does not confirm any specific theory about the lost Primarchs or the Soul Drinkers' true lineage. But the evidence in the text points towards something deliberate rather than accidental, and the shape of that something looks very much like the kind of secret the Imperium of the 41st millennium would rather not acknowledge. That somewhere in its history is a story of a Primarch who was right about something important and was destroyed for being right about it. Section 8. The Trial on the Phalanx Justice, Revelation, and the Hidden Conspiracy. The Phalanx is one of the most extraordinary structures in the Imperium. It is enormous, built to the Imperial Fist specifications, which means it has been designed and redesigned and reinforced over 10,000 years of continuous improvement by warriors who think about fortification the way other people think about breathing. It carries everything a chapter needs to function: forges, apothecarians, chapels, training decks, the specialized equipment of a mobile chapter in perpetual readiness. It is both a warship and a home, and a monument to what Space Marines are. And it was supposed to be among the most secure environments in the Imperium. The trial of the Soul Drinkers was convened as a formal conclave on its decks. Chapter Master Vladimir Pugh of the Imperial Fists presided. Rhaenez, former captain of the Crimson Fists who had surrendered his rank and was walking the warrior's pilgrimage, was appointed prosecutor, which gave him the official mechanism to express the personal fury that had been building for years. Captain Borganner, of the Howling Griffins, who had lost a leg to Sarpedon in an earlier engagement, attended as a representative of the chapters directly harmed. Librarian Varnica of the Silver Skulls brought psychic capability and a more analytical approach to the proceedings. Captain Nicolo of the Iron Knights was the only person at the trial who showed consistent inclination toward giving the Soul Drinkers a genuinely fair hearing. Lord Inquisitor Colgo represented the Inquisition. Sister Ascarian represented the Adepta Sororitas. Commander Gethsemar of the Angels Sanguine was there for reasons that would prove far more significant than anyone expected. The proceedings were not dignified. Rhaenez and Borganner both advocated loudly and repeatedly for immediate execution, their professional grievances and personal wounds coloring every intervention they made. Lysander, who had captured Sarpedon himself, served as a moderating force, insisting that whatever verdict emerged had to have genuine integrity rather than being a performance of justice over a predetermined conclusion. Evidence was presented. The Soul Drinkers had attacked Imperial institutions. They had fought the Imperium's forces on multiple occasions across multiple worlds. They were visibly mutated, which was itself evidence of chaos corruption by the standards the Inquisition applied. They were renegades whose status had been officially established for decades. The case for execution was simple and straightforward. Then Gethsemar of the Angels Sanguine presented something that nobody had been expecting. The Angels Sanguine are a Blood Angels successor chapter whose sanguinary priests specialize in managing the unique biological complications of Blood Angels' gene seed. They had obtained a sample of Soul Drinkers' gene seed and subjected it to thorough analysis. Their examination had produced a result that fundamentally changed the premises of the trial. The Soul Drinkers' gene seed was not Rogal Dorn's. It could not be traced to the Imperial Fists. Its origin, after exhaustive examination, was genuinely unknown, not corrupted beyond recognition, not degraded to the point of unidentifiability, simply not matching any known Primarch lineage in the archives. The Soul Drinkers had spent their entire existence, thousands of years, believing they were the genetic sons of Rogel Dorn, believing the Soul Spear was given to them by their Primarch as a symbol of shared heritage, believing their chapter history was what the records said it was. None of that was true. Who they were descended from was a mystery the available evidence could not resolve. The Soul Drinkers in the courtroom were as stunned as anyone else. This was not information they had been suppressing. They genuinely did not know. The identity they had built everything on, the heritage they had fought to honor for centuries, the Primarch whose name they had invoked in their greatest moments of crisis, all of it had been a story, a fiction so complete and so old that it had fooled them along with everyone else. The theories about what this means are worth spending time with because they point towards something genuinely mysterious at the heart of the Soul Drinkers' story. The most persistent theory involves the two lost Primarchs, the 2nd and the 11th, who are absent from every record with a completeness that suggests something more intentional than simple forgetting. If a Primarch was purged from history because they had said or done something the Emperor could not forgive, or because they represented a threat to the future the Emperor was building, the Astartes descended from them would need to be given false histories to prevent anyone from following the lineage back to the truth. The fact that the Soul Spear responded only to the Soul Drinkers' unique genetic signature, only theirs, not Rogel Dorn's blood, despite what the stories said, suggests that the weapon was always authentically theirs, created for them specifically, regardless of whatever cover story was attached to its origins. The idea that a Primarch would give one of his successor chapters a weapon that only worked for them but told them it was keyed to his own blood would be a strange deception. A much more logical explanation is that the weapon was given to them by their actual Primarch, whoever that was, and the Imperial Fists connection was invented afterwards to provide a respectable lineage. What kind of Primarch would produce a chapter with the Soul Drinkers' specific character? Their insistence on placing humanity's welfare above institutional compliance, their capacity for moral independence, their willingness to reject authority that had become unjust rather than simply complying. These are traits that might make perfect sense if they came from a Primarch who said something similar to the Emperor himself and paid for it with erasure from the records. If one of the lost Primarchs believed that humanity deserved the right to self-determination, or that warriors owed their loyalty to the people rather than to the institution, or that the Emperor's purpose was best served by sometimes acting against the Emperor's commands, that Primarch would be exactly the kind of figure the Imperium might decide it was better to forget entirely. This remains speculation. What is not speculation is that the revelation about the gene seed had thrown the trial into genuine uncertainty, complicated the simple narrative of loyalist versus traitor beyond easy resolution, and created an atmosphere where nobody was quite sure what the right verdict actually was. Then, while the proceedings were still reverberating from this revelation, the Order of the Blinded Eye moved, a cult that had been operating quietly through the Imperium for generations, whose origins nobody at the trial understood yet, freed the Soul Drinkers from their cells. Dainiathos, brought aboard the Phalanx from his tomb on Salaka, was freed as part of the same sequence of events. The Predator's eye was ready to be opened. Everything that came before this moment had been preparation for what came next. Section 9. Dainiathos, the Predator's Eye, and the final battle of the Phalanx. The full scope of what Dainiathos had done began to emerge during the interrogation of Brother Kion and from Dainiathos himself, who seemed not particularly interested in concealing the truth now that the final phase of his plan was in motion. He had begun developing his philosophy and his plan during his years as Reclusiarch, the chief chaplain of the Soul Drinkers, in the 36th millennium. He had watched the Imperium carefully, had thought extensively about what he observed, and had reached conclusions that seemed logical to him but were, in their practical implications, catastrophic. He believed the Imperium was corrupt. He believed its people were essentially cattle, incapable of steering their own evolution toward anything better without being led by something genuinely superior. He believed that Space Marines occupied a position of authentic superiority that came with an obligation to lead rather than serve. And he believed that the Imperium's corruption had become so deep and structural that nothing short of civilizational catastrophe would produce the conditions for something better to emerge. He decided to cause that catastrophe, and then, in the ashes, to build the thing he believed should have been built in the first place, The Catechism's marshal was his mechanism for preparing the soul drinkers to be the tool he needed. By building into their philosophical foundation, a framework that placed spirit above institutional letter, by cultivating the chaplaincy as a body of agents loyal to his vision, rather than to the chapter's legitimate leadership, he had been shaping the soul drinkers across generations to eventually break from the Imperium, not through direct instruction, through the slow shaping of worldview that a text read by every member of a culture across many generations can achieve. He had also made an alliance with Abraxas. The daemon prince of Siench had approached him at some point in the distant past, and Deinyathos had been sophisticated enough to engage with the proposition. Abraxas could act in real space. Abraxas could manipulate events across vast distances. Abraxas had been the architect of fate, the entity speaking through Yezer's visions, guiding the soul drinkers through their early renegade period. The plan had been running for 6,000 years. Every major event in the soul drinkers' history since the 36th millennium had been part of it. All of it moving toward this moment where they would be brought aboard the Phalanx, where Deinyathos would be brought aboard the Phalanx, and where the Predator's Eye could be opened. The Predator's Eye was a warp gate, a physical portal between real space and the Immaterium, that Deinyathos had stolen from its original location in the Kravamesh system during the assault on Vandir's palace at the end of the Age of Apostasy. He had concealed it within the structure of the Phalanx itself during the chaos of that war, and it had been sitting there, hidden, for 5,000 years. The Imperial Fists had been living and fighting aboard a fortress monastery that contained a direct doorway to the warp, installed there by someone who had been waiting to use it ever since. Deinyathos intended to use the blood of a son of Dorn to open the Predator's Eye, bringing Abraxas and his demonic legions through into the Phalanx. From there, he would use the Phalanx as his personal vehicle, carrying it across the galaxy, spreading demonic invasion on a scale not seen since the Horus Heresy. The catastrophe would destroy enough of the Imperium's current form that something new could emerge from the wreckage. And Deinyathos, who had spent 6,000 years alone in the dark thinking about what that something new should be, would be there to guide it into shape. The Order of the Blinded Eye, a cult he had seeded into existence across the centuries specifically for this moment, kidnapped Captain Nicolo of the Iron Knights, whose blood as a son of Dorn was the key to opening what Deinyathos had spent millennia hiding. The Predator's Eye opened, Abraxas came through, and the daemonic legions of all four Chaos Gods followed, each faction brought through by the temporary ceasefire that Siench had arranged to make this moment possible. Daemons of Tzeentch, Nurgle, Khorne, and Slaanesh, all fighting alongside each other in the particular way that only a plan 6,000 years in the making could arrange. The four gods of chaos agreed on essentially nothing, except that this specific opportunity was worth setting aside their eternal conflicts for a brief period. Chaplain Ictinos revealed himself at last. His flock, the warriors he had been quietly cultivating within the chapter for exactly this moment, joined the daemonic side. Ictinos had been Deinyathos' agent all along, the chaplain who had guided Sarpedon through every crisis, who had been present at every significant moment of decision, who had advised the moves that brought the chapter to exactly this place, had never been Sarpedon's ally. He had been the inside agent, the patient long-term manipulation, the hand on the tiller that Deinyathos had needed inside the chapter. Here is where the story turns. The surviving soul drinkers who had not followed Ictinos looked at the daemonic invasion pouring through the Phalanx's corridors and made a choice. They went to Vladimir Pugh. They said, "The Phalanx is under demonic assault. Let us fight beside you." They made no claims about their own righteousness. They did not ask for their sentences to be commuted. They offered what they had, the specific combat capability of Space Marines who had spent decades surviving impossible situations to help fight off something that needed fighting off. The trial, the verdict, the question of what happened to them afterward, all of that was secondary. Pugh agreed. What followed was one of the most chaotic engagements in the Phalanx's history. The daemonic forces of all four Chaos Gods filled corridors built by Rogel Dorn's paranoid precision and found that the defenders, Soul Drinkers and Imperial Fists and Howling Griffins and Silver Skulls and Sisters of Battle all fighting together, refused to break. Librarian Tyrendian of the Soul Drinkers was swallowed by a great unclean one, one of Nurgle's most powerful servants. He overloaded his own psychic power from within the daemon's body, converting himself into a psychic detonation, destroying both himself and the daemon simultaneously. He chose his manner of dying and made it count. Captain Luco fought with everything he had to keep Abraxas occupied, buying time for the warp gate to be sealed. The mechanism for closing the Predator's eye involved using the blood of Rhaenys, the former Crimson Fist's captain who had been consumed by his own rage, into joining Ictinos' flock as the sealing agent. The same lineage that had opened the gate was needed to close it. Luco kept Abraxas pinned long enough for Librarian Varnica of the Silver Skulls to complete the sealing. The warp gate closed. Abraxas was cut in half by the portal as it sealed, banished again to the warp, leaving his demonic armies suddenly cut off from their patron and their power source. The Imperial defenders took the advantage immediately. Sarpedon found Ictinos during the fighting and pressed his psychic power directly into the corrupted chaplain's mind, forcing from it everything Ictinos knew about Deinyathos' plans and intentions. The psychic assault was brutal and thorough. Ictinos' mind was shattered completely by it. Sarpedon threw him out of an airlock. The man who had guided and betrayed the chapter for years died in the void, without dignity, which seems appropriate for someone who had spent their service wearing a mask of faithfulness over something entirely contrary to it. Sarpedon went to find Deinyathos, the ancient dreadnought, 6,000 years of patience and certainty and corrupted vision held together by metal and the specific stubbornness of something that had decided long ago not to stop, faced the last chapter master of the Soul Drinkers in the bowels of the Phalanx. Sarpedon was dying. The wounds accumulated across decades of impossible situations had found a sum that exceeded even what an Astartes body could overcome. But the Soul Spear was in his hand, the weapon that responded only to the Soul Drinker's unique genetic signature, the weapon that had been, perhaps, always, specifically theirs. He drove it into Deinyathos. He cracked the adamantium sarcophagus open. He reached inside and pulled out the withered body that had been piloting the dreadnought for 6,000 years. This ancient thing that had spent millennia alone in the dark, becoming increasingly certain about things that were increasingly wrong. This man who had decided that the end justified any means and then chose an end so catastrophic that the means they required became catastrophic in turn. He carried what remained of Deinyathos to the closing warp gate. He stood before Vladimir Pugh and the assembled representatives of every institution that had spent decades trying to destroy his chapter. He gave his final address. He warned them about the danger of following beliefs too blindly. He told them to be vigilant about chaos corruption, meaning both the obvious kind and the subtler kind that had worked on Deinyathos through centuries of absolute certainty about his own rightness. He told them to pursue the imperial truth rather than the institutional shell that had grown up around it. He spoke with the clarity that comes to people when there is nothing left to protect and no reason to say anything other than what they believe to be true. Then he walked through the closing warp gate, dragging a screaming Deinyathos with him into the immaterium, into whatever exists on the other side of the boundary between real space and the warp, into whatever keeps demons and the echoes of things that have been pulled into its depths. Luco and Gravis, the last two surviving soul drinkers who had not died in the Battle of the Phalanx, had made their own choice moments before. They would not submit to Imperial Fist's custody, not because they were enemies of the Imperium, but because they had been at war with everything for so long, declared enemies of every institution for so long, that there was no longer any form of belonging to the world as it existed that felt true or possible. They stepped through the warp gate before it closed, together, choosing the unknown over a universe that had no place for them. The gate closed. Sarpedon was gone. Luco and Gravis were gone. Deinyathos was gone, screaming, dragged into consequences that 6,000 years of careful planning had not managed to avoid. The daemonic invasion of the Phalanx was over. The Soul Drinkers were gone. Section 10. What was left behind: legacy, vindication, and the chapter reborn. The aftermath of the Battle of the Phalanx was complicated in ways that institutional ledgers are not designed to handle. Vladimir Pugh and the Imperial Fists surveyed what was left of the battle they had just fought alongside the warriors they had been about to execute. The accounting had a moral dimension that the formal categories of the Imperium's law struggled to contain. The Soul Drinkers had come to the trial honestly, not fighting their way free, not negotiating from a position of deception. They had allowed themselves to be captured and brought to judgment. And when the crisis came, when the phalanx itself was under assault from demonic legions that would have used the greatest mobile fortress in Imperial history as a vehicle for spreading chaos across the galaxy, they had fought beside the Imperial fists and their allies until there was nothing left of them to fight. They had proved their loyalty in the most definitive way possible. With their lives used up completely in defense of the Imperium they had spent decades not being part of. The Imperial fists inscribed a column in the Phalanx's Apothecarion with the names of every fallen soul drinker. The Apothecarion is where the Astartes of the chapter are honored and remembered. The names of the fallen are kept there alongside the gene seed of the honored dead. Placing the soul drinkers' names in that space was a statement that went beyond what any verdict in the trial could have accomplished. Not a legal exoneration, not an official reversal of their status, but a moral statement about what these warriors had ultimately been. They were worthy. Whatever the official record said, whatever labels had been attached to them across decades of renegade existence, whatever complicated and compromised path they had walked to reach this ending, they had ended as something that deserved to be remembered the right way. The High Lords of Terra ordered an edict of obliteration. In Imperial law, this is standard procedure when a chapter falls to chaos, a mechanism for removing all official records of the chapter's existence from the archives, making them officially unmentionable in Imperial documentation. It was the final bureaucratic indignity applied to warriors who had just saved the Phalanx from a demonic invasion that would have been catastrophic on a civilizational scale. The paperwork of condemnation running alongside the practical reality of heroism, the Imperium's institutional machinery grinding on regardless of what had actually happened. But then came the era Indomitus. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, tore across the galaxy in the final years of the 41st millennium, a wound in reality larger than anything seen since the Horus Heresy. The Imperium was cut in half. Countless worlds were overrun or isolated. It was, by any reasonable measure, the worst crisis humanity had faced in 10,000 years. And out of that crisis came the Primaris Space Marines, created by Archimagos Belisarius Cawl, using techniques he had spent 10,000 years developing at the secret instruction of Robot Guilliman. Guilliman returned from his long suspension in a stasis chamber to command the Indomitus Crusade. In the Ultima Founding, many chapters that had been lost or destroyed were refounded using Primaris Marines. Guilliman went through the records, what remained of them after various edicts of obliteration had done their work, and determined which chapter names and heritages should be carried forward into the new era of the Imperium. He refounded the Soul Drinkers. Their name, their colors, the purple and gold that had identified them for thousands of years were reinstated. A new chapter was created, composed entirely of Primaris Space Marines who had never known Sarpedon or the Broken Back, or any of the history that had consumed their predecessors. They were new warriors, wearing an old name, carrying forward a legacy they knew nothing about, beginning again without the weight of what had come before. Their first major campaign was the Keprian Reclamation, fighting against chaos forces, and they performed with the fierce capability that characterizes new Primaris chapters, establishing their identity. They drew some inquisitorial interest, as chapters in unusual circumstances tend to do. An inquisitor named Steno made observations about their gene seed that produced a result that should have surprised nobody who knew the original chapter's history. The Primaris Soul Drinkers, created using gene samples from the Sang Primum Portum, the great gene vault containing the original biological heritage of all founding Astartes legions, did not match any known lineage precisely. Their gene flaws were similar to those of the original chapter, which meant that whatever the original Soul Drinkers were in genetic truth, Cawl had found a sample of it and used it for the refounding. The mystery of their ancestry did not end with the chapter's destruction. It came with them into their second existence. The new Soul Drinkers do not carry the Catechism's Martial. That text burned along with everything else in the collapse of the original chapter, and even if it had survived, giving a brand new chapter the philosophical groundwork of a text deliberately designed to turn them away from the Imperium would be a questionable choice. They fight without the framework that both defined the original chapter's remarkable ethical coherence and provided the mechanism for their manipulation and destruction. Whether that represents a loss or a mercy is genuinely difficult to say. The philosophical depth that gave the Soul Drinkers their distinctive moral character also made them vulnerable to the specific corruption that Dionysos embedded in their foundations. There may not be a version of the Catechism's Marshal that provides the first without the second. There is a novella, Traitor by Deed, written by Ben Counter, who also wrote the original 6 novels, that begins to engage with what the new Soul Drinkers are becoming. The older books, the 6 novels collected in the omnibus editions, Redemption and Annihilation, along with the novella Dionysos, that tells the philosopher soldier's own story from his perspective across the centuries, remain among the most philosophically serious space marine fiction the Black Library has produced. Ben Counter understood something important when he wrote The Soul Drinkers. He understood that the most interesting questions about space marine culture are not tactical, but moral. What do you owe to the people you serve? What do you owe to the institution that commands you? And when those two obligations conflict, which one wins? The Soul Drinker's story is, at its core, the story of what happens when a culture of warriors that has been shaped to ask that question honestly is finally forced to answer it, and then has to live with the consequences of that answer for the rest of its existence. The Soul Drinkers' war cries tell the whole story in miniature. They shouted for Dorn for thousands of years, calling on a father who may not have been their father at all. They shouted, "Cold and fast, Soul Drinkers," describing their method, but not their meaning. And in the desperate middle of their renegade decades, they sometimes shouted, "For the Emperor and freedom," which captured exactly the contradiction that defined them: loyal to the Emperor, insurgent against the institution, believing that both positions were not merely compatible, but necessary. They betrayed the Adeptus Mechanicus when the Mechanicus betrayed them first. They betrayed their chapter master because his instinct to submit felt, to Sarpedon and the chapter veterans shaped by Dionysos' philosophy, like the wrong instinct for that moment. They betrayed the Imperium's institutional authority because that authority had proven itself capable of theft, of threats, of the casual declaration that soldiers who had served faithfully for thousands of years were enemies simply because they objected to being stolen from. They refused to betray chaos in the way the dark gods expected them to, by serving it. They refused to betray each other in the way that desperation demands, until desperation and bad leadership and the consequences of deliberate choices they could not have fully understood produced a civil war they could not entirely avoid, and they never betrayed the Emperor. Every choice, every compromise, every difficult and sometimes terrible decision was made within a framework that placed genuine service to humanity above every other loyalty. They were wrong about some things. They made mistakes that cost lives, sometimes innocent lives. Their vision of what they were doing was sometimes more noble than what they were actually doing. But the core of what they were trying to be never changed, across decades of pressure that should have dissolved it long ago. In the end, they died, saving a fortress of the Imperium they had been enemies of. That does not resolve all the accounting. The worlds that suffered because of their decisions do not disappear from the ledger. The people who died in conflicts they created or contributed to are still dead. But the statement they chose to make with the last thing they had left, the act of choosing to fight for the Imperium one final time when they had every reason not to, stands as the final definition of what the Soul Drinkers actually were. The column in the Phalanx's Apothecarion has their names. The Brokenback drifts somewhere in the void, empty now. The Soul Spear is gone with Sarpedon into the warp, which seems appropriate. And on worlds across the Imperium, warriors wearing purple and gold and carrying the golden chalice insignia patrol and fight and serve, without knowing that the name they carry was built in blood and doubt, and a philosophical tradition designed to make them exactly what they ended up being: people who asked why and could not stop asking even when everything depended on stopping. Section 11. Dionysos himself, the villain who made the whole story possible. Before we close this story entirely, we should spend time with Dionysos himself, because he is the figure around whom everything else orbits, and he deserves to be understood on his own terms, rather than simply as the villain who pulled strings from the shadows. Ben Counter wrote a novella specifically about Dionysos' life, told in the form of an interrogation report. In it, we see Deniathos as a young warrior at the Second Siege of Terra during the Age of Apostasy, fighting alongside his chapter brothers against the forces of Vandyre. He encounters an Imperial guardsman named Fidelian who tells him something that stays with him. To flee death is worse than death itself. He meets an Inquisitor named Kaede on an Exterminatus mission, who tells him that humanity is its own worst enemy, that the Space Marines and the Inquisition must lead humanity, lest humanity destroy itself. These encounters plant seeds. Deniathos begins to think seriously about what it means for Space Marines to lead rather than serve, about what the relationship between enhanced warriors and ordinary humans actually should be. He joins the Reclusium, becomes a chaplain, begins writing the Catechisms Martial as a text that he hopes will put the Soul Drinker's spirit on paper. He genuinely believes in what he is writing, at least at first. He genuinely loves the chapter. He is not simply a cold manipulator from the beginning, but somewhere during those years he crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. He notices that what he has written in the Catechisms Martial implies something he had not consciously intended. That if the High Lords of Terra are human, and humans are cattle who need to be led, then the Space Marines who serve the High Lords are servants of cattle, which is a logical impossibility if Space Marines are supposed to be the leaders. Unless the Space Marines secede from the Imperium entirely, the Reclusiarch Gorosius notices the same implication and brings it to Deniathos' attention, expecting an addendum, a correction. Deniathos kills Gorosius, not in combat, not in any way that leaves evidence. He arranges for the Reclusiarch to die in an accident during a hunt for a dangerous heretic they are both pursuing. And in that moment, by killing someone to prevent being held accountable for what he had written, Deniathos crosses from being a philosopher with dangerous ideas into being something else. The ideas he had been entertaining become plans. The plans become a conspiracy. The conspiracy becomes a 6,000-year project in patient, comprehensive manipulation. He cultivates his own flock of loyal chaplains to serve as long-term agents within the chapter. He writes more of the Catechisms Martial, understanding now that he is not writing wisdom but programming, not philosophy but a trigger mechanism set to a delay of millennia. He becomes the most revered figure in the chapter's history, precisely because he has designed himself to be revered, understanding that the reverence will be his most powerful tool after he is gone. And then he arranges his own disappearance. He tells the chapter he is going somewhere, to some isolated world known only to him, and that he will die there. He tells them this is necessary, that he must leave so that he will become a legend, as revered as Dorn himself. He gets in a dreadnought sarcophagus and has his loyal servants hide him away, and the chapter is told that Deniathos, the warrior philosopher, has perished, and eventually there is no one left alive who knew him personally, and the legend is complete and unchallenged. What is most interesting about Deniathos is not that he was evil in a straightforward sense. His analysis of the Imperium's corruption was not entirely wrong. The Imperium is genuinely corrupt. The High Lords of Terra are genuinely self-serving in ways that harm the people the Imperium is supposed to protect. The gap between the institution and the purpose it was built to serve is genuinely enormous. Deniathos saw all of this clearly and accurately. His diagnosis was not wrong. His prescription was catastrophically wrong. He believed that the solution to a corrupt institution was to destroy enough of it through massive violence that something better could emerge. He believed that the suffering this would cause was a price worth paying for the outcome. And he believed that he specifically was the right person to guide what came after the destruction, that his 6,000 years of patient thinking had produced the understanding necessary to do it correctly. This is the specific failure mode of very intelligent people who have been alone with their thoughts for too long. The certainty that understanding a problem deeply implies the ability to solve it. The confidence that the clarity of your analysis translates into the wisdom of your prescription. Deniathos was absolutely right about what was wrong. He was absolutely wrong about what should be done about it, and about his own fitness to do it. He screamed when Sarpedon dragged him through the warp gate, 6,000 years of certainty and scheming, and at the end of it, he screamed. Whatever waited for him in the warp was not what he had planned for. He had spent his existence planning for everyone else's future, and had neglected to plan carefully enough for his own. The warp is not kind to things that enter it without protection. What happens to the echo of Dinyathos in whatever space he entered is not something the records address. But the four gods of chaos had been watching his scheme from the beginning, had been displeased when their agent Abraxas failed in the Battle of the Phalanx, and were not likely to greet with warmth the small, withered, screaming thing that the last chapter master of the Soul Drinkers had dragged through the closing portal as his final act of defiance. There is a certain justice in that ending that the 41st millennium does not often manage to achieve. The architect of 6,000 years of manipulation, who had used everyone around him as a tool and discarded them when they had served their purpose, found himself at the end in the hands of something considerably more powerful than he was, with nothing to offer and no plan that could help him now. The Soul Drinkers got their own ending too. Not a happy one, not a triumphant one, but one that was theirs, chosen by them, consistent with what they had always been. They died fighting for the things they believed in the context that mattered most, and they took the person who had designed their destruction with them into the consequences. In the 41st millennium, where most stories end in simple tragedy or simple victory, something about that feels like the best possible kind of resolution. Section 12. Themes, legacy, and why this story still resonates. Stories that endure tend to endure because they are asking questions that do not become less relevant with time. The Soul Drinkers are asking a question that every large institution eventually forces its members to face. When the thing you have pledged your life to serve becomes something you cannot recognize as worthy of that pledge, what do you do? The answers people give to that question reveal character more completely than almost anything else. You can comply. You can leave quietly. You can fight from the inside. You can fight from the outside. You can try to hold the contradiction together and be both servant and critic simultaneously. You can convince yourself that the institution will improve if you just stay loyal long enough, that the system is worth preserving through your individual faithfulness, even when it fails you consistently. Each of these choices is sometimes right and sometimes catastrophically wrong, and knowing which applies to your specific situation requires exactly the kind of moral judgment that no hierarchy can perform for you. The hierarchy can tell you what the rules are. It cannot tell you whether following the rules on any given occasion is actually the right thing to do. That judgment is yours and yours alone. The Soul Drinkers tried most of these approaches over the course of their story. They fought from the outside. They tried to do the Emperor's work independently, without authorization, on their own terms. They disagreed among themselves about the right path, and sometimes settled those disagreements with violence. They were manipulated and used and betrayed and haunted by losses that kept accumulating no matter how well they fought. They arrived at the end of their road having neither fully triumphed nor been entirely destroyed, vindicated in ways that came too late to matter for almost every warrior who had followed Sarpedon through those decades. That is not a story about winning. It is a story about what you choose to be and what you refuse to become, and whether those commitments survive everything the universe can throw at them. The Soul Drinkers were not simply rebels. They were also not simply heroes. They occupied the space between those categories that the 41st millennium is not designed to acknowledge, but which is in practice where most moral life actually happens. Perfect compliance and perfect resistance are both rare. Most of the time, people are doing the best they can with imperfect understanding in constrained circumstances, making compromises that seem necessary and living with the consequences of those compromises, trying to hold on to something genuine in the middle of all the pressure to let it go. The Catechism's marshal, poisoned as it was, gave the Soul Drinkers something valuable alongside the damage it did. It gave them a language for thinking about what they were doing and why. It gave them a tradition of asking the question rather than simply following orders. Even if that tradition was designed to eventually turn them toward specific conclusions, the habit of asking was genuine, and the warriors shaped by it were genuinely better at being warriors for having developed it. The tragedy of the Soul Drinkers is not that they asked the question. It is that the answer they found was provided to them by someone who had decided the answer before they started asking, and who had shaped everything around them to ensure they would reach his predetermined conclusion. They thought they were exercising genuine moral autonomy. They were, without knowing it, following a script written 6,000 years before. And yet, when Dinyathos' plan finally revealed itself in full, When Ictinos' flock joined the demonic invasion and the alternatives became clear, the soul drinkers who remained chose for themselves. Sarpedon and Leuco and Gravis, and the warriors who died in the Battle of the Phalanx, were not following the Catechism's marshal in that final hour. They were following something else, something that Dynyathos' careful conditioning had not managed to corrupt or remove, which was the simple and genuine desire to be the thing they had been told they were, servants of humanity, fighters against the actual darkness, rather than fighters against the institutions that stood in their particular way. The chapter ended. The name continues. And in whatever space exists beyond the closing warp gate, whatever form of existence persists in the immaterium for those who enter it, Sarpedon is there with the soul spear and the screaming architect of everything that destroyed his chapter, and Leuco and Gravis are with him, having chosen each other over a universe that could not figure out what to do with them. The column in the Phalanx's Apothecarion carries their names. That is the Imperium saying, in the only language it knows how to use, that it was wrong about them. Not officially, not in any way that changes the legal record, but in the way that matters, the way that tells the next generation of warriors who pass through those halls what kind of people deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be remembered. For all their failures and all their compromises and all the harm that their decisions caused in the galaxy, they deserve to be remembered because they stayed themselves. Because what Dynyathos could not corrupt was the part of them that genuinely cared about the people they were fighting for, the part that drove them to face Abraxas and refuse him, to fight Tetarak's empire while being hunted, to stand between Dark Eldar's schemes and innocent populations when nobody had asked them to walk into the Battle of the Phalanx knowing they were probably going to die in it and choosing to go anyway. That is what a Space Marine is supposed to be. They were never supposed to be compliant. They were supposed to be the Emperor's finest, which means the finest of what humanity can produce, which means something considerably more than just obeying orders from the right authority. The Soul Drinkers were that. In the hardest possible way, through the most difficult circumstances, at enormous cost, they were that. Closing thoughts. Thank you for spending this time in the company of one of Warhammer 40K's most unusual and most morally serious stories. If you made it all the way here, you are exactly the person this kind of deep lore exploration is made for. The Soul Drinker's story exists in the 6 novels by Ben Counter, Soul Drinker, The Bleeding Chalice, Crimson Tears, Chapter War, Hellforged, and Phalanx, collected in the omnibus editions Redemption and Annihilation, published by Black Library. The novella Dynyathos expands the story of the philosopher-soldier himself, and Traitor by Deed, the more recent novella, begins the story of the refounded Primaris chapter. If any part of what we discussed today has engaged your interest, those books are worth your time. Hit the like button if you found this worthwhile, and subscribe if you have not already, because there are more stories like this one waiting. Stories with no clean heroes and no clean villains. Stories where the 41st millennium's darkness does not simplify anything, but instead forces every character to be exactly what they are, without the comfort of easy categories. Drop a comment below. Tell me which moment in the Soul Drinker's story resonated most with you. Was it the theft at the Van Scorvold Star Fort, and how something that small in the grand scale of things set everything in motion? Was it Sarpedon refusing Abraxas at the exact moment when refusing felt impossible? Was it the revelation about Dynyathos and his 6,000 years of patient, corrupted patience? Or the final image of Sarpedon walking through a closing warp gate, dragging the architect of his chapter's destruction with him, choosing that ending over every other one that was available to him? The Emperor protects, even when the institution built in his name does not, even when the warriors serving that institution are declared its enemies for trying to hold it to its own principles. Even when the only vindication available comes after everything is already lost. The Soul Drinkers knew that, and in the end, knowing it was enough. End of script. A note on the books themselves. Ben Counter wrote the Soul Drinkers across a long stretch of time and development, and the difference between the early novels and the later ones reflects his growth as a writer, engaging with material he clearly cared about. The first 2 books, Soul Drinker and The Bleeding Chalice, are the most action-focused. They establish the situation and drive the narrative hard toward the consequences of the Starfort incident and the mutation crisis. They are propulsive and kinetic and do not stop often to sit with the implications of what is happening. By the time you reach Chapter War, and particularly Phalanx, something has shifted. The narrative slows in the best possible way. It is more interested in the experience of being these particular people in this particular situation. Sarpedon's internal life becomes richer and more textured. The supporting cast becomes more individually realized. The questions the story is asking become more explicit without becoming heavy-handed. Phalanx, the final novel, is structured as essentially a siege story and a courtroom drama and a revelation story all at once. Encounter manages the combination with real skill. The Phalanx itself becomes a genuine presence in the narrative, its history and architecture and significance all contributing to the weight of what happens within its corridors. The demonic invasion is frightening in the way that demonic invasions in good Warhammer fiction are frightening, not because the daemons are simply overwhelming in power, but because of what they represent. The breach of the boundary between what should exist and what should not, the violation of space that was supposed to be secure. The Daniathos novella, which tells the philosopher-soldier's story from his own perspective, is essential reading for understanding the full scope of the betrayal at the center of the saga. Counter writes Daniathos with genuine sympathy, which is the hardest and most important thing to do with a villain whose plan involves mass murder on a civilizational scale. He does not make Daniathos's motives shallow or his reasoning stupid. He makes them comprehensible and even partially correct, and then shows how comprehensible and partially correct reasoning, pushed far enough and sustained long enough without friction from other perspectives, produces outcomes that are catastrophic in ways the reasoner could not see coming, precisely because they had insulated themselves from the friction that would have corrected the errors. If you are going to read one piece of supplementary material alongside the 6 novels, the Daniathos novella is the one. It is the other half of the story, the shadow that the main narrative casts, the explanation for why the catastrophe was shaped the way it was. The Traitor by Deed novella, most recent of the Soul Drinker's fiction, gives the refounded Primaris chapter its opening chapter. It is a different story. These are new warriors in an old name, without the history that shaped their predecessors, facing a galaxy that has changed enormously since the events of the Battle of the Phalanx. Whether they will develop the same philosophical depth that the Catechisms Martial gave the original chapter, through experience rather than embedded text this time, is a question the ongoing fiction has not yet fully answered. The answer to that question might be the most interesting story still left to tell in the Soul Drinker's canon. Inquisitor Thaddeus, the man who watched and couldn't look away. If the Soul Drinkers are the center of their own story, Thaddeus is the most interesting figure orbiting that center. He begins his role in the saga as a straightforward hunter, an inquisitor with a mandate and the competence to pursue it. He ends it as something harder to classify. A man who had done his duty and found himself uncertain whether duty was the right framework for evaluating what he had been a part of. He first picked up the Soul Drinker's trail during the Stratix Luminae operation. He arrived looking for confirmation of what his briefing told him to expect. A renegade chapter, chaos-tainted, a threat to the Imperium. What he found instead were warriors in the middle of a genuine campaign against a genuine chaos threat, fighting with the discipline and purpose that characterized the best Astartes units, making decisions that an honest, chaos-corrupted force would not make. They were not slaughtering Imperial citizens. They were not worshipping dark gods. They were fighting Teteract, whose empire of disease and corruption was killing hundreds of worlds worth of people. Thaddeus was an inquisitor. His training was specifically in finding the difference between surface appearance and underlying reality. He was not naive enough to think that fighting a chaos threat was proof of innocence. Chaos can fight itself. The gods use pawns they discard when the utility expires. A chaos-tainted chapter could theoretically be deployed against a rival god's champion. But the longer he watched, the harder that interpretation became to sustain honestly. The Soul Drinkers were not fighting Teteract for strategic advantage within some demon-level political game. They were fighting him because he was killing people, and because killing him would stop that. Their motivations, as far as Thaddeus could observe them, were exactly what they would be if the chapter were what Sarpedon claimed they were. Renegades who had rejected corrupt institutions, but never rejected the people those institutions existed to protect. He worked alongside Sarpedon to bring down Tesseract. This is the moment that cannot be erased from the record or explained away. An Imperial Inquisitor, with the authority and capability to attempt destroying the Soul Drinkers, chose instead to work with them toward a common objective. Because the common objective was genuinely more important than the official mandate at that specific moment, and Thaddeus was honest enough about both his priorities and the situation to act accordingly. He filed his reports afterward. He included the information about the Soul Drinkers' role in Tesseract's defeat. But the framing of those reports, what he chose to emphasize and what he chose not to, was shaped by the conclusions he was drawing from what he had directly observed rather than from the official classification of the chapter he was hunting. He was not an advocate for the Soul Drinkers. He never became one. But he became a witness to something the official narrative could not account for, and he was too honest to pretend that the witness account and the official narrative matched each other. That specific discomfort, the discomfort of the honest person who cannot make what they have seen fit what they have been told, is the most recognizable human experience in the entire Soul Drinkers story. By the time the trial was being convened on the Phalanx, Thaddeus was no longer in a position to affect the proceedings significantly. But his observations across the years he had spent pursuing the chapter had produced a record that careful readers could use to understand what the Soul Drinkers had actually been, as distinct from what the official classification said they were. He had pursued them faithfully. He had found them doing faithfully what they claimed to be doing. He reported both of these things accurately. The institutions receiving those reports did not change their response based on the observation, but the observation existed as a matter of record, available to anyone who wanted to look honestly at what had happened. That is the best outcome available in a universe that does not generally reward honesty with anything except the personal integrity of having been honest. The chaplains and the corruption of the spirit. The chaplains of the Soul Drinkers play a fascinating and ultimately devastating role in the chapter's story. Chaplains in any Space Marine chapter are the keepers of tradition and spiritual health. They perform the rituals that connect warriors to their heritage. They maintain the liturgical life of the chapter, the prayers and invocations and ceremonies that give meaning to sacrifice and provide a framework for why any of this is worth doing. They are the voice that speaks for the chapter's soul when military necessity threatens to reduce everything to tactical calculation. In the Soul Drinkers, this role was additionally shaped by the Catechism's martial, which meant that the chaplaincy was not merely maintaining traditions of faith, but also maintaining a specific philosophical tradition that Dionysos had embedded in the chapter's foundations. The chaplains were simultaneously spiritual leaders and carriers of the philosophy that would eventually break the chapter from the Imperium. Yeaser, the chaplain whose visions drove the Soul Drinkers' early renegade decisions, was a genuine believer. His faith was real. His visions were real, in the sense that something was genuinely communicating with him through them. The tragedy of Yeaser is that he could not have known that the source of those visions was not divine guidance, but calculated manipulation. Because the manipulation was sophisticated enough to use real spiritual experiences as its medium. The specific horror of being manipulated through your own genuine faith is that nothing you experience feels wrong. Everything is real. Everything means something. The manipulation lies in what it leads you toward, not in the falseness of the experience itself. Abraxas killed Yeaser when Yeaser was no longer useful. This is Tsench at its most brutally honest. The Chaos powers do not maintain obligations to the tools they use. When the tool has served its purpose, the tool is discarded. Yeaser spent years believing himself an instrument of genuine revelation, and when the revelation had accomplished what it needed to accomplish, the entity behind it ended him, without particular ceremony or sentiment. Iktinos is the more complex case. He was Dionysos' long-prepared agent, patient across decades, holding his position through multiple crises, advising Sarpedon with what appeared to be genuine wisdom and genuine care for the chapter. His advice was consistently plausible, consistently grounded in the chapter's actual situation, consistently pointing in directions that seemed reasonable from Sarpedon's perspective. He had to be consistent and credible for the entire plan to work. A double agent who gives consistently bad advice is eventually identified and removed. Iktinos gave good advice on everything that was not directly relevant to Dionysos' endgame, which meant that When the advice he gave was designed to move the chapter toward the specific outcomes Deinyathos needed, it arrived embedded in a track record of trustworthiness that made questioning it seem irrational. This is the sophisticated form of the manipulation. Not a single dramatic betrayal, but a decades-long accumulation of trustworthiness, used finally as a vehicle for the one specific guidance that mattered to the plan. By the time Ectinos' true allegiance became clear in the Battle of the Phalanx, he had already guided the chapter to exactly where Deinyathos needed it to be. His revelation changed nothing about the final outcome of the plan. It changed everything about what the surviving Soul Drinkers understood about their own history. The role of chaplain, in the Soul Drinkers' case, had been turned against the chapter twice. Once through Ysir, whose genuine faith was exploited by Abraxas. Once through Ectinos, whose position of trust was used by Deinyathos. The chapter's spiritual health, the thing the chaplaincy existed to maintain, had been the precise vector through which the corruption entered. Chapter War, when brothers become enemies. The internal conflict that produced 2 chapter wars across the Soul Drinkers' renegade existence is the element of their story that most clearly distinguishes them from simple heroic narratives. Heroes do not kill their own chapter masters. Morally complex protagonists do. Sarpedon's duel with Gorgolion at the beginning of the Renegade period was not a villainous act. It was also not an uncomplicated heroic act. Gorgolion believed, sincerely and with reasoning, that was not simply cowardice or corruption, that the chapter's survival required submission to the Imperium in response to the crisis created by the theft of the Soul Spear. He had watched the Mechanicus steal what should have been theirs. He had felt the same outrage. But his assessment of the chapter's ability to survive as a renegade force, hunted by every arm of the Imperium simultaneously, was that it would not. That submission, however humiliating, was the only option that left any warriors alive to serve the Emperor in the long term. He was not wrong as an assessment of the situation. The Soul Drinkers' renegade existence was, in fact, enormously costly. They spent decades being hunted, losing warriors at a rate that ground them down from several hundred to barely 100 survivors. If the goal were simple survival and maximum long-term contribution to the Imperium's war effort, Gorgolion's assessment was probably the more realistic one. But Sarpedon's assessment of what submission would mean was also not wrong. Submitting to authority that had just stolen from them, in response to threats that the authority making those threats had no legitimate standing to make, under circumstances where compliance would validate the theft and confirm the lesson that the Mechanicus could do whatever it wanted to any chapter that could not stop it. Submitting in that moment would have changed the chapter in ways that the physical survival of the warriors involved could not compensate for. 2 genuine positions in genuine conflict, neither man villainous. The mutation that gave Sarpedon his 8 arachnid legs, expressing itself in the middle of the fight, changing the geometry of the duel in ways that Gorgolion's training could not fully account for, resolved the conflict through biology rather than argument. Sarpedon won. The chapter followed Sarpedon. Gorgolion is dead. The Second Civil War, the conflict with Eumenes, had a different character. Eumenes' grievances were real. His criticism of Sarpedon's leadership decisions was not baseless. The chapter kept getting smaller. The missions kept incurring costs that accumulated without producing security or sustainability. There was genuine space for the argument that different leadership will him produce different outcomes. But Eumenes' method of pursuing his legitimate grievances made impossible the kind of honest internal dialogue that might have led to genuine reform. He organized covertly. He built a faction. He moved against Sarpedon with the support of an outside force, the Howling Griffin's librarian Mercano, rather than confronting the issue through the chapter's existing mechanisms. And then he killed Mercano when the librarian had served the tactical purpose Eumenes needed, demonstrating that he was capable of treating his own allies as expendable tools in exactly the way that Deinyathos' deeper plan was treating the entire chapter. Whether Eumenes had been more directly influenced by Ectinos' advice than we know is an interesting question. Ectinos was advising throughout the Vanqualis period. He was in a position to encourage divisions, to nurture Eumenes' sense of grievance, to suggest that direct action was the appropriate response. The text does not confirm this. But Iktinos' track record of steering situations toward outcomes that serve Dynyathos' plan makes it worth noting that the second chapter war left the Soul Drinkers significantly weakened, significantly demoralized, and heading toward the Veiled Regions on Iktinos' council. Whatever the causation, the outcome was a chapter of 250 warriors making their final approach to the Necron-haunted rim of the galaxy, led by a chapter master who had twice won his position through combat with the previous holder, shaped by a tradition that had been deliberately corrupted, accompanied by a chaplain whose loyalty was not to them. What Sarpedon understood that Dynyathos did not. In the final confrontation between Sarpedon and Dynyathos, in the bowels of the Phalanx, while demonic legions fought through corridors designed by Rogel Dorn, the contrast between the two figures is as clear as it will ever be. Dynyathos had spent 6,000 years becoming increasingly certain. He had thought and planned and calculated across a span of time that most human consciousnesses cannot sustain without losing something essential about what it means to be human. He had fed the machine he had been placed in with his certainty, kept it running on the fuel of absolute conviction that he was right, that his vision was correct, that the catastrophe he was engineering was worth the cost it would exact. He had forgotten something. Or rather, he had never really understood it in the first place, the understanding that you cannot build anything worth having on a foundation of caused catastrophe. That systems do not emerge from the ashes of carefully engineered disasters as their engineer plans them to. That the history of people who have deliberately destroyed institutions in order to build better ones on the wreckage is overwhelmingly a history of wreckage followed by more wreckage, not by better institutions. The complex adaptive systems of civilization do not respond to catastrophic disruption by producing the outcome their disruptors intended. They respond by producing chaos, from which whatever emerges reflects the circumstances of the chaos rather than the plans of the person who caused it. Sarpedon had been shaped by the same philosophical tradition as Dynyathos. He had read the same texts. He had been influenced by the same philosophical framework, but decades of actual experience, of watching plans encounter reality and being forced to adjust, of making decisions with incomplete information and living with the consequences, of watching warriors die for causes that did not always produce the intended outcomes, had given him something Dynyathos' long isolation in a sarcophagus had calcified away: humility. The specific humility of a person who has been wrong before and knows it, who has updated their understanding based on experience, who is aware that the certainty of their own reasoning is not a guarantee of the correctness of their conclusions. Sarpedon did not know, in the Battle of the Phalanx, that fighting for the Imperium was the philosophically correct thing to do in some absolute sense. He knew it was the right thing to do in the specific circumstances of that specific moment. There were daemons in the corridors. The daemons needed to be stopped. The Phalanx and everyone on it needed protecting. Fighting to protect it was clearly correct, regardless of what any broader philosophical framework said about the institution that Flagship represented. That is the wisdom that 6,000 years in a sarcophagus had taken from Dynyathos. The ability to act clearly in the present moment, rather than waiting for the moment to fit the theory. The understanding that the right thing to do is often simply visible in front of you without needing to be derived from first principles. Dynyathos had spent so long thinking about the future he intended to create that he had lost the ability to see the present clearly. Sarpedon, worn down by decades of hard experience, had nothing left except the present and a clear-eyed view of it. And in that final meeting, the man who had lived clearly for decades was more formidable than the man who had planned brilliantly for millennia. That is the most important lesson the Soul Drinker's story offers. Not that loyalty matters, not that institutions deserve respect, not that chaos is always wrong and the Imperium is always right. Those are too simple, and the story knows they are too simple. The lesson is that presence matters. Being actually, honestly present in the situation you are in, rather than managing it from inside a theory about what it should be, is the basis of every right decision that ever gets made in complicated circumstances. Sarpedon was present until the very end. Dynyathos had been absent for 6,000 years. And in the final accounting, presence beat planning, as it usually does. The warriors who died, carrying the story forward. One of the things that separates the Soul Drinker's saga from simpler military fiction is its commitment to making the individual deaths meaningful. Not every warrior who falls in battle is a named character with developed interiority. That would be impossible in a story covering this many battles over this many years, but the deaths that matter to the narrative are treated with the weight they deserve. And the cumulative effect of so many losses across 6 novels is something that genuinely builds. Nisrius, the librarian who held the line in the early battles after the chapter's excommunication, whose power was the difference between survival and destruction in more than one engagement. His death opened a gap in the chapter's psychic capability that could never be fully replaced. Scamander, the scout with latent psychic talent that Sarpedon discovered and used during the Second Chapter War to escape his imprisonment, a young warrior whose ability suggested he might have been genuinely remarkable in a chapter that could have given him the time and stability to develop it. He did not get that time. Ligris, who deserves to be mentioned again because the loss of him specifically was among the most significant the chapter experienced. Not in tactical terms, though his knowledge of the Broken Back was irreplaceable. In human terms, he was the person who had kept the physical home of the chapter alive for decades, whose expertise was so particular and so hard-won that nobody else could have done what he did. The chapter was less itself without him, in a way that went beyond the sum of his capabilities. Tyrendian, who in the Battle of the Phalanx converted his own life into a weapon precisely calibrated to end a threat that conventional weapons could not address, and who made that choice with the clarity that people sometimes achieve when they understand exactly what they are worth and exactly what they can accomplish and exactly what the situation requires. Each of these deaths is a real loss in the story. Not a stepping stone to a protagonist's development, not a motivation device for Sarpedon to get angry about. An actual specific loss of an actual specific person who had been doing something meaningful and who will not do it anymore. The chapter that arrives at the Phalanx for its trial is not merely a smaller version of the chapter that stood at the Van Scorvold Starfort at the beginning. It is a collection of survivors who have outlasted everyone around them, carrying losses that do not get resolved because losses like those do not resolve. They become part of who you are. Sarpedon carries all of them into that final battle. He carries Gorgoleon, whom he killed, and the weight of that decision. He carries Ysir, whose faith was exploited. He carries Telos, whose mutation he could not stop, and whose transformation he could not reverse, and whose death on Endymion 4 he could not prevent. He carries every warrior who followed him into the renegade life and did not make it back. That is what he is fighting for in the Battle of the Phalanx. Not a strategic objective, not the Imperium's approval, not his own survival. He is fighting for the accumulated weight of everyone who gave something irretrievable to a cause that deserved to be honored by the person still alive to honor it. And when he walks through the closing warp gate at the end, dragging Daniathos with him, he is carrying all of them into whatever comes next. In the grim darkness of the far future, that is the closest thing to resurrection that the setting allows. Not survival, not triumph, but the choice to spend what remains of yourself on something that matters to the people who cannot choose for themselves anymore. The Soul Drinkers chose that every time they had a chance to choose, right up until the moment they couldn't choose anything anymore. If you've made it this far, drop a comment. Tell me which of them you'll remember longest. Like the video if the story hit you the way it hit me when I first read through these books. Subscribe if you want more of this, because there are dozens of chapters with stories this deep and this complicated, and this is exactly the kind of coverage they deserve. The Emperor protects. Sometimes through the people he never officially acknowledged as his own, sometimes through exactly the warriors the institution he built decided were enemies. Olives grow on the roughest hillsides, cold and fast. Soul Drinkers.